Her name was Henrietta Lacks, but scientists knew her simply as HeLa. In 1951, Henrietta was a young mother who visited the doctor because she felt a knot inside her. Without her knowledge or permission, doctors took a tiny piece of her cells to study. At the time, scientists had been trying to keep human cells alive outside the body for decades, but the cells always died. Henrietta's cells were different. They never died. They doubled their numbers every 24 hours, growing with a mythological intensity. Soon, her cells were being mass-produced and shipped all over the world. They were used to help create the polio vaccine. They went up in the first space missions to see what zero gravity would do to human cells. And they helped scientists uncover the secrets of cancer, genetics, and cloning. But for decades, no one knew who Henrietta really was. When it came time to write the story, Rebecca faced a giant challenge. How could she fit decades of history, complicated science, and a deeply emotional family journey into a single narrative? She decided to weave 3 different storylines together like a braid. One strand is the story of Henrietta and her miraculous cells. The second is the story of Henrietta's family. And the third is the chronological journey of Rebecca and Deborah traveling together to uncover the truth. Critics and readers everywhere have praised the story because it reads exactly like a thrilling novel, even though every single word is true. It has been called a deeply compassionate and beautifully written saga that explores giant questions about science, bioethics, and race in America. It dives into the dark history of medical experimentation on Black Americans and raises important questions about who owns our bodies and our cells. Most importantly, while this story celebrates the scientific miracles made possible by HeLa cells, it finally restores a human face to the woman who made it all possible. It is a story of science and medicine, but at its heart, it is a story about a daughter longing to know her mother. Part 1. Life. On January 29, 1951, David Lacks sat behind the wheel of his old Buick, watching the rain fall outside Johns Hopkins Hospital. He waited with 3 of his children as his wife, Henrietta, hurried inside past the colored bathroom, which was the only one she was allowed to use. Usually, no one in her family visited a Hopkins doctor without stopping to rub the big toe of a beautiful marble statue of Jesus for good luck. But that day, Henrietta didn't stop. She went straight to the gynecology clinic's waiting room and told the receptionist, "I got a knot on my womb." For more than a year, Henrietta had been telling her closest friends that something felt wrong inside her. One night, she even let her cousins Margaret and Sadie feel her stomach. She told them that it hurt terribly, and she had a knot inside. Her cousins thought she might be pregnant outside of her womb, but Henrietta knew it was a knot. Still, she refused to go to the doctor. In those days, people didn't talk much about cancer, and her friends figured she kept it a secret because she was afraid a doctor would remove her womb and stop her from having children. Shortly after this, Henrietta did get pregnant with her 5th child, Joe. Her cousins assumed the baby was the cause of her pain, but Henrietta insisted the knot was there before the baby arrived. 4.5 months after Joe was born, Henrietta noticed unexpected bleeding. She filled her bathtub with warm water, checked herself, and found exactly what she feared: a hard lump deep inside feeling like someone had lodged a marble near the opening of her womb. She finally told her husband it was time to see a doctor. A local doctor first thought the lump was a sore from an infection, but when the test came back negative, he sent her to Johns Hopkins. Hopkins was one of the top hospitals in the country, originally built as a charity hospital for the sick and poor. During this era of segregation, known as Jim Crow, many white-only hospitals would turn black patients away, even if they were dying in the parking lot. David drove Henrietta nearly 20 miles to Hopkins because it was the only major hospital for miles that would treat black patients. Even there, the hospital was segregated, with colored-only wards and colored-only water fountains. When the nurse called her name, Henrietta was led into a colored-only exam room with glass walls. She changed into a starched white hospital gown and waited for Dr. Howard Jones. Dr. Jones reviewed her medical chart, which showed she had a 6th or 7th grade education, was a mother of 5, and had missed several doctor's appointments in the past. For Henrietta, a hospital was a terrifying and confusing place. She knew all about farming tobacco and butchering pigs, but she had never heard medical words like cervix or biopsy. Like many black patients at the time, she only went to Hopkins when she felt she had absolutely no other choice. Henrietta explained her pain and the bleeding to Dr. Jones. When he examined her, he found a hard, shiny purple lump exactly where she said it would be. He later described it as looking like grape jello, and it was so delicate that it bled at the slightest touch. Dr. Jones had seen easily 1,000 cervical cancer lesions, but he had never seen anything quite like this one. He cut a small piece of the lump to send to the pathology lab for a diagnosis and told Henrietta to go home. After she left, Dr. Jones dictated his medical notes. He found her medical history very interesting. Henrietta had just delivered a baby at that very hospital 3 months earlier, and no one had noticed any abnormalities on her cervix then. This meant that either her doctors had completely missed it during her past exams, which seemed impossible, or this terrifying tumor had grown at an incredibly fast rate. Henrietta Lacks was born Loretta Pleasant in Roanoke, Virginia, on August 1, 1920. No one knows how she became Henrietta. In 1924, her mother, Eliza, died giving birth to her 10th child, and her father, Johnny Pleasant, took the children back to Clover, Virginia. His family still farmed the tobacco fields their ancestors had worked as slaves. Because no one in Clover could take all 10 children, relatives divided them up, and Henrietta ended up living with her grandfather, Tommy Lacks. Tommy lived in what everyone called the home house, a 4-room log cabin that once served as slave quarters. It had plank floors, gas lanterns, and water that Henrietta had to haul up a long hill from the creek. The air inside stayed so cool that when relatives died, the family kept their corpses in the front hallway for days so people could visit and pay their respects. Tommy was already raising another grandchild named David Lacks, but everyone called him Day. Day was born out of wedlock, and when he arrived into the world, he was blue and not breathing. A white doctor wrote "stillborn" on his birth certificate and left. But a cousin and midwife named Munchie rubbed his chest until he finally gasped for breath, and his skin warmed to a soft brown. By the time Henrietta moved into the home house, She was 4, and Day was almost 9. No one could have guessed she would spend the rest of her life with him. As children, Henrietta and Day woke up every morning at 4 o'clock to milk the cows and feed the chickens, hogs, and horses. They tended a garden filled with corn, peanuts, and greens, then headed to the tobacco fields with their cousins to plant tobacco behind mule-drawn plows. Day stopped going to school in the 4th grade because the family needed him to work the fields, but Henrietta stayed until the 6th grade. She walked 2 miles past the white school, where children threw rocks and taunted her, to the colored school, a 3-room wooden farmhouse hidden under tall shade trees. Anytime school wasn't in session, she was out in the fields with Day and her cousins. Life wasn't all work, though. When they finished in the fields, the cousins ran straight to a swimming hole they made by damming the creek behind the house. At nightfall, they built fires with pieces of old shoes to keep the mosquitoes away, played tag and hopscotch, and danced until Grandpa Tommy told them to go to bed. Piles of cousins packed into the crawl space above a little wooden kitchen house and slept until their grandmother woke them with the smell of fresh biscuits. During harvest season, the family took their tobacco to the town of South Boston, which was home to the nation's 2nd-largest tobacco market. Henrietta and her cousins rode through the night in a flat wagon on a bed of tobacco leaves. When they arrived at the massive auction warehouse, they listened to the auctioneer rattle off numbers and played tag around the tobacco piles. At night, white farmers slept upstairs in lofts, while black farmers slept down in the dark basement on a dusty dirt floor alongside horses, mules, and dogs. Back in Clover, Henrietta and her cousins would hire themselves out to pick tobacco for white folks for 10 cents. They used that money to see their favorite Buck Jones cowboy movies. The theater owner showed silent black and white films, and his wife played happy carnival-style music on the piano for every scene, even the sad ones. Henrietta and the other black children sat up in the colored section next to the clicking projector. As Henrietta grew older, she became the prettiest girl in town, with a beautiful smile and walnut eyes. A cousin named Crazy Joe Grinnin was so in love with her that he would do anything to get her attention. Once he jumped straight through the ice of a frozen pond in the middle of winter and refused to come out until she agreed to go on a date with him. Another time, when he found out Henrietta was going to marry Day, he stabbed himself in the chest with a dull pocket knife. But Henrietta and Day had been sharing a bedroom since she was 4, and they eventually started having children together. Their son Lawrence was born just months after Henrietta's 14th birthday, and their daughter Elsie came along 4 years later. Elsie had conditions people later called epilepsy and mental retardation. The folks in town just said she was simple. Henrietta and Day married alone at their preacher's house on April 10, 1941, without a honeymoon because there was too much work to do on the farm. Soon World War II broke out, and the demand for steel skyrocketed. A cousin named Fred Garrett had moved north to work at Bethlehem Steel's Sparrows Point steel mill in Turner Station, a small community of black workers outside Baltimore. The plant was booming, paying black workers about 80 cents an hour, which was more than most of the Lacks family had ever seen. Fred came back to Clover and convinced Day to move to Baltimore, buying him a bus ticket north. A few months later, Henrietta boarded a coal-fueled train from Clover. Leaving behind the tobacco fields of her youth, 21-year-old Henrietta held a child on each side and stared out the window at rolling hills and wide-open bodies of water for the first time, heading toward a new life. After her visit to Johns Hopkins, Henrietta returned to her usual life, cleaning and cooking for her family. But a few days later, her doctor, Howard Jones, received her biopsy results from the pathology lab. Epidermoid carcinoma of the cervix, stage 1. At that time, cervical carcinomas were divided into two types: invasive carcinomas, which had penetrated the surface of the cervix, and non-invasive carcinomas, which had not. The non-invasive type was sometimes called sugar icing carcinoma because it grew in a smooth layered sheet across the surface, but its official name was carcinoma in situ. Most doctors in 1951 believed that only the invasive type was deadly, so they did not treat carcinoma in situ aggressively. However, Jones's boss, Richard Wesley Talindi, one of the top cervical cancer experts in the country, disagreed. He believed carcinoma in situ was simply an early stage of invasive cancer and required aggressive treatment to save lives. Diagnosing these early stages had just become possible thanks to a new test called the Pap smear, which allowed doctors to scrape cells from the cervix and examine them under a microscope. To prove his theory, Talindi wanted to grow living samples from normal and cancerous cervical tissue in a laboratory. He believed that if he could prove the two types of cancer behaved similarly in a lab, he could convince other doctors that he was right. Talindi contacted George Guy, the head of tissue culture research at Hopkins. Guy and his wife Margaret had spent decades trying to grow malignant cells outside the body to find cancer's cause and cure. They were determined to grow the first immortal human cells, which would be a continuously dividing line of cells that would constantly replenish themselves and never die. Guy took any cells he could get his hands on, calling himself the world's most famous vulture. So when Talindi offered him cervical cancer tissue in exchange for trying to grow some cells, Guy immediately agreed. Talindi began collecting samples from any woman who walked into Hopkins with cervical cancer, including Henrietta. On February 5, 1951, Dr. Jones told Henrietta that her biopsy was malignant. Henrietta kept this a secret from her friends and family and went on with her day as if nothing had happened. That night, she simply told her husband, Day, that she needed to return to the doctor the next day for some tests and medicine. The next morning, she went straight to the hospital admissions desk and signed an operation permit form, which gave the doctors consent to perform any surgical care they deemed necessary. Henrietta's tumor was the invasive type, which hospitals nationwide treated with radium, a white, highly radioactive metal. Radium kills cancer cells, but it also destroys any normal cells it encounters and can cause mutations or severely burn a person's skin. On the morning of her first treatment, Henrietta was given anesthetic and lay unconscious in the operating room. Before inserting the radium to treat her tumor, the surgeon on duty, Dr. Lawrence Wharton, Jr., took a sharp knife and shaved 2 dime-sized pieces of tissue from Henrietta's cervix, one from the tumor and one from the healthy tissue nearby. No one had told Henrietta that Talindi was collecting samples, and no one asked if she wanted to be a donor. Wharton placed the samples in a glass dish, inserted a tube filled with radium inside Henrietta's cervix, and sewed it in place. He then wrote in her medical chart that the biopsy tissue was given to Dr. George Guy. A resident took the dish with the samples down the hall to Guy's lab. Guy was always excited to receive new tissues, but everyone else in his lab saw Henrietta's sample as just another tedious experiment. They had been trying and failing to grow cells for years, and they were completely sure that Henrietta's cells would die, just like all the others. George Guy's 21-year-old assistant, Mary Kubitschek, was eating her lunch in a lab that looked a lot like an industrial kitchen. The room was filled with tin coffee cans holding utensils, massive metal freezers storing biological samples, and cages full of mice. Guy walked into this busy room carrying the pieces of Henrietta's cervix. Mary was honestly tired of trying to grow cells in culture, because for years, every sample they meticulously prepared had eventually died. She had been hired straight out of college simply for her incredible hand strength and dexterity, which were completely necessary for the delicate cutting and handling of tissues. Back in 1951, growing cells was an enormous scientific challenge, because no one knew exactly what nutrients they needed to survive. George Guy and his wife Margaret constantly adjusted the liquid used to feed the cells, searching for the perfect balance. Their recipes sounded like a witch's brew, mixing chicken plasma, pureed calf fetuses, special salts, and blood from human umbilical cords. George would regularly drive to local slaughterhouses to collect cow fetuses, and he would even wrestle live chickens to draw their blood for the lab. Another massive obstacle to growing cells was contamination. Bacteria and microorganisms from unwashed hands, human breath, or even microscopic dust particles could easily find their way into the dishes and destroy the cultures. Fortunately, Margaret had been trained as a surgical nurse, so preventing deadly infections through strict sterility was her specialty. She taught George and the rest of the lab how to keep cultures perfectly clean, and she relentlessly patrolled the workspace to make sure everyone followed her rules. She even hired a woman specifically to wash the glassware, using only Gold Dust Twins soap, which Margaret was so obsessed with that she bought an entire boxcar full of it when she feared the company might go out of business. To avoid Margaret's wrath, Mary followed the sterilization rules perfectly before handling Henrietta's sample. She stepped into a small, airtight cubicle, sterilized it with hot steam, hosed down the floor, and scrubbed her workspace with alcohol. Then, she carefully sliced Henrietta's tissue into tiny 1-millimeter squares, dropped them onto chicken blood clots inside dozens of test tubes, and covered them with the culture medium. Using the first 2 letters of the patient's first and last names, she labeled each tube HeLa. Mary then placed the tubes into an incubator room holding a machine called a roller drum, which George had built by hand. George had grown up poor in Pittsburgh and paid for his biology degree by working as a carpenter and mason. He was a brilliant tinkerer who built his own lab equipment, mostly from junkyard scraps. For instance, he once built a time-lapse motion picture camera out of old motors and microscope parts to capture the incredibly slow process of cell division on film. His roller drum invention was a large wooden cylinder that slowly turned the test tubes 24 hours a day. George believed this rotation was crucial because the culture medium needed to be in constant motion, just like blood and fluids flowing inside the human body. While Henrietta spent 2 days recovering from her hospital treatment and eventually went home, Mary checked on the test tubes. She fully expected the cells to die like all the rest. But 2 days after Henrietta left the hospital, Mary noticed little rings of growth around the clots. Soon, the cells were doubling every 24 hours. They grew with unbelievable intensity, filling as much space as Mary gave them. As long as they had food and warmth, Henrietta's cancer cells grew 20 times faster than her normal cells, which died just days after Mary cultured them. George Guy soon told a few close colleagues that his lab might have finally grown the first immortal human cells. And when they asked for samples to study, he happily said yes. Henrietta had no idea that her cells were silently growing in a laboratory. After leaving the hospital, she simply went back to her normal life. She spent her time cooking big pots of spaghetti for her family and churning butter on the steps of her old home. When her husband, Day, was working the night shift, Henrietta and her cousin Sadie would count to 100 after the door slammed, put on their dancing clothes, and sneak out of the house to go to the local clubs. Sadie always said that Henrietta made life come alive and brought out the good in everyone she met. Henrietta was a beautiful, sturdy woman who loved to take care of her appearance, always making sure to paint her fingernails and toenails a deep red. She and Sadie would often sneak out just to avoid Ethel, a jealous cousin-in-law whose husband had a crush on Henrietta. But Henrietta's life also carried deep sadness, especially regarding her oldest daughter, Elsie. Elsie had conditions that people later recognized as epilepsy and mental disabilities, and she was eventually sent to Crownsville State Hospital, which used to be called the Hospital for the Negro Insane. Elsie could not talk and often hurt herself, and she had grown too big for Henrietta to handle alone, with a new baby in the house. Henrietta visited Elsie once a week to hold her and play with her hair, and her cousins believed a part of Henrietta died the day she had to send her daughter away. Henrietta also had her hands full with her teenage son, Lawrence, who often sneaked off to swim at a dangerous, contaminated old pier in town. Henrietta would march down there with a switch to whip him and keep him safe, which was one of the very few times anyone ever saw her get truly angry. For a month and a half, no one in her community even knew Henrietta was sick. She kept her cancer a complete secret. Then, at a local carnival, she climbed onto a Ferris wheel with Sadie and her cousin Margaret. When their seat stopped at the very top, swinging high in the air, she finally confessed that she had cancer. Still, she tried to protect them from worrying, promising that she was fine and that the doctors were fixing her right up. At first, it looked like she was right, because her tumors completely vanished after her initial radium treatments. But a few weeks later, the bleeding started again, and she had to go to Johns Hopkins Hospital every single weekday for intense X-ray radiation therapy. During these visits, she asked her doctor when she would be well enough to have another baby. It was only at that moment she found out the treatments had left her completely infertile. She later told her doctors that if they had warned her she would never be able to have children again, she would not have gone through with the treatment. Eventually, the radiation took a terrifying and painful toll on her body. She began feeling like she was burning inside, and she could barely make the short walk to her cousin's house without feeling exhausted. One afternoon, as she lay on the couch, Henrietta lifted her shirt to show her cousins what the treatments had actually done to her. Sadie gasped in horror, because the radiation had charred the skin from Henrietta's breasts all the way down to her pelvis to a deep coal black. Seeing her cousin's shock, Henrietta quietly whispered, "Lord, it just feels like that blackness be spreadin' all inside me." 11 years after first learning about Henrietta Lacks in a community college biology class, Rebecca turned 27 and stumbled upon a collection of scientific papers. They were from the HeLa Cancer Control Symposium, an event organized in Henrietta's honor by Roland Patillo, a professor and scientist in Atlanta. Hoping to connect with Henrietta's family, Rebecca called Patillo. However, he immediately warned her that the Lacks family had gone through a terrible time with the HeLa cells and would not want to talk. Before he would even consider introducing Rebecca to the family, Patillo grilled her for an hour to see what she knew about the history of African Americans and science. Rebecca explained what she had learned about the infamous Tuskegee syphilis study. In that study, researchers watched hundreds of African American men die slow, painful deaths just to see how the disease progressed, even after a cure was found. She also talked about other injustices, like doctors performing unnecessary surgeries on poor black women. After hearing this, Patillo decided Rebecca was honest about her intentions. He agreed to give her the phone number for Henrietta's daughter, Deborah, but he laid out a strict list of rules. Rebecca had to be honest, compassionate, patient, and she could never talk down to Deborah. Moments later, Rebecca dialed Deborah's number and blurted out that she wanted to write a book about her mother. Because Deborah was nearly deaf and relied on lip reading, Rebecca had to slow down and pronounce every syllable clearly. To Rebecca's surprise, Deborah was thrilled, yelling that people only ever cared about the cells and never worried about her mother's real name. For the next 45 minutes, Deborah poured out a chaotic mix of stories spanning from the 1920s to the 1990s. She talked about a man who had stolen her mother's medical records, a brother who was in prison for murder, and her terrifying belief that white doctors at Johns Hopkins had experimented on her mother. Deborah was deeply exhausted, explaining that all the stress about her mother's cells had nearly caused her to have a stroke. More than anything, she just wanted to know the simple, everyday details of her mother's life. She desperately wanted to know what her mother smelled like, what her favorite color was, and if she liked to dance. Suddenly, someone walked through Deborah's front door with the mail, which caused Deborah to panic. She abruptly hung up the phone, promising to talk to Rebecca on Monday. However, when Rebecca called back, Deborah sounded like a completely different person. Her voice was depressed, monotone, and slurred, as if she were heavily sedated. She mumbled that she couldn't talk anymore, explaining that her brothers thought she should write her own book. If Rebecca wanted to learn about Henrietta, Deborah said, she would have to convince the men in the family. She gave Rebecca the phone numbers for her father, Day, and her brothers, Lawrence and Sonny, before hanging up. For days, Rebecca called the numbers, but no one answered. Finally, a young boy picked up the phone at Day's house. When Rebecca asked for David, the boy yelled for his grandfather, saying, "Lady's on the phone about his wife cells." Eventually, Day took the receiver. When Rebecca explained who she was and why she was calling, he let out a deep, exhausted sigh. He mumbled in a thick Southern accent, "Well, so let my old lady cells talk to you and leave me alone. I had enough of you people." Then he hung up. On April 10, 1951, just 3 weeks after Henrietta Lacks started radiation therapy, George Guy appeared on television in Baltimore. With dramatic music playing in the background, the announcer promised viewers that they would learn how science could conquer cancer. Guy showed the audience a clear glass bottle filled with massive quantities of cancer cells, which were most likely Henrietta's cells. He explained that his lab was using these cells to find ways to damage or completely wipe out cancer. To help make that happen, Gay began sending Henrietta's cells to any scientist who might use them for research. Today, shipping live cells through the mail is normal, but back then, it was a brand new idea. Gay sent them on airplanes in tubes with just a few drops of liquid food to keep them alive. Sometimes, pilots or flight attendants would tuck the tubes into their shirt pockets to keep the cells at body temperature, as if they were in an incubator. Other times, Gay tucked the tubes into holes carved in blocks of ice to keep them from overheating in the cargo hold. Henrietta's cells traveled to researchers in Texas, India, New York, and Amsterdam, and they even rode into the mountains of Chile in the saddlebags of pack mules. These cells were incredibly precious because they allowed scientists to perform experiments that would have been impossible to do on a living human. Scientists could cut the HeLa cells apart, expose them to endless radiation and toxins, and bombard them with different drugs to see if they could kill malignant cells without destroying normal ones. If the cells died during an experiment, it didn't matter, because scientists could just go back to their eternally growing HeLa stock and start over again. Despite all this amazing new research, the general public knew nothing about HeLa. And even if they had known, they probably wouldn't have cared. For decades, the press had been promising that cell culture was going to save the world. But by 1951, the public had stopped buying it. Instead of a medical miracle, cell culture had become something out of a scary science fiction movie. This fear all started on January 17, 1912, when a French surgeon named Alexis Carrel grew what he called an immortal chicken heart. Scientists had been trying to keep tissues alive outside the body for years, but their samples always died. Carrel set out to prove it was possible, and to everyone's amazement, his sliver of chicken heart tissue kept beating in a culture dish, as if it were still inside the bird. Months later, Carrel won a Nobel Prize for his other work in organ transplantation. But newspapers confused his awards and made it sound like his chicken heart was the fountain of youth. Headlines around the world claimed that death was perhaps not inevitable. Magazines called his culture medium an elixir of youth, and claimed that bathing in it might make a person live forever. But Carrel was an eccentric and dark character. He was a eugenicist who dreamed of never-ending life for white people and death, or forced sterilization, for everyone else he considered inferior. He later even praised Hitler for his horrific actions. Carrel also wrongly believed that light could kill cell cultures, so his laboratory looked like a terrifying scene. His technicians worked in long black robes with black hoods, sitting at black tables in a shadowless room painted entirely black. Through all of this, the press and public remained obsessed with Carrel's immortal chicken heart. Every year, reporters would call him to check on the cells, and stories promised that the cells would change medicine. But they never did. Instead, Carrel's claims grew more fantastical, saying the cells could eventually reach a volume greater than the solar system. The fear of tissue culture eventually found its way into American living rooms through a 1930s radio horror show called Lights Out. It told a fictional story about an immortal chicken heart that grew out of control, filling city streets like a monster and consuming everyone in its path. The real chicken heart cells didn't actually fare so well. Years later, a scientist named Leonard Hayflick discovered that normal cells can only divide a finite number of times before dying, meaning the original chicken heart cells had probably died very quickly. Hayflick concluded that Carrel had accidentally, or intentionally, been putting new cells into the culture dishes every time he fed them with an embryo juice made from ground tissues. Either way, by 1951, when Henrietta Lacks' cells began growing in the Guy lab, the public image of immortal cells was completely tarnished. It had been just 5 years since the famous chicken heart had died and been thrown in the trash. To the public, tissue culture wasn't something to be celebrated. It was simply the stuff of racism, creepy science fiction, and snake oil. In early June of 1951, Henrietta went back to the doctors and told them she felt the cancer spreading through her body. But the doctors found nothing wrong and wrote in her medical chart that she felt fairly well and there was no evidence the cancer had returned. Henrietta didn't question them because back in the 1950s, patients usually deferred to whatever their doctors said. At that time, a practice called benevolent deception was common, where doctors often withheld frightening information from patients, believing they knew what was best. This was especially true for Black patients in public, segregated hospital wards in Baltimore, who rarely questioned the judgment of white doctors. Black patients often received treatment at later stages of their illnesses, were given less pain medication, and experienced higher mortality rates than white patients. Just a few weeks after being told she was fine, Henrietta returned complaining of an ache in both her sides, but the doctor simply noted that she should return in a month. 2.5 weeks later, the pain in her abdomen was so severe she could barely walk or urinate, so a doctor emptied her bladder with a tube and sent her home once more. Only 3 days after that, a doctor finally felt a stony, hard mass in her stomach, and an X-ray showed a tumor attached to her pelvic wall that was nearly blocking her urethra. The doctors declared it was inoperable. Noting that she was chronically ill and obviously in pain, the doctor sent her home to bed. Before this rapid decline, only Henrietta's husband Day and her closest cousins knew she was sick, but suddenly everyone in her neighborhood knew. Her husband and cousins could hear her wailing in pain from a block away as they walked home from work. Her cousin Sadie remembered that Henrietta didn't just fade away physically at first, but her eyes showed that she knew she was going to die. Stone-hard tumors quickly filled her abdomen, growing on her uterus, kidneys, and urethra. Just a month after a note in her chart said she was healthy, her doctors wrote that her outlook was very poor, and they began using radiation just to try and ease her terrible pain. Each day the doctors increased the radiation, burning the skin on her stomach blacker and blacker, while her pain only grew worse. On August 8th, just a week after her 31st birthday, Henrietta checked into the hospital and asked to stay because she was in so much agony. A doctor took another sample of her cancer cells for George Guy, the scientist who had successfully grown her first cells. However, Henrietta's body was now so poisoned by toxins from her blocked kidneys that these new cells died immediately in the laboratory. During her first few days in the hospital, Day brought their children to visit, but saying goodbye made Henrietta cry for hours. The nurses eventually decided the visits were too upsetting and told Day he couldn't bring the kids inside anymore. Instead, Day would park his car outside the hospital at the same time every day and let the children play on the grass right below Henrietta's window. She would pull herself out of bed and press her face against the glass to watch them, until she became too weak to even make it to the window. The doctors tried everything to ease her suffering, using strong pain medications like Demerol and morphine, and even injecting pure alcohol straight into her spine. But nothing worked for long. New tumors seemed to appear every day, and her fever reached 105 degrees. Defeated by the cancer, her doctor stopped the radiation treatments and wrote in her chart, "Henrietta is still a miserable specimen. She groans." Most people believed George Guy never met Henrietta, but one of his colleagues, a microbiologist named Lore Aurelian, remembered things differently. Aurelian recalled Guy leaning over Henrietta's hospital bed and telling her that her cells would make her immortal. He explained that her cells would help save the lives of countless people. Hearing this, Henrietta smiled and told him she was glad her pain would result in something good for someone else. A few days after her first phone conversation with Henrietta's husband, Rebecca drove from Pittsburgh to Baltimore to meet Henrietta's son, David "Sonny" Lacks, Jr., but he did not show up. She waited in a downtown Holiday Inn, staring out the window at a tall brick tower with a huge clock that spelled BROMOSELTZER. As she waited, she read a 1976 magazine article by Michael Rogers, the first reporter to ever contact the Lacks family. Amazingly, decades earlier, Rogers had sat in the exact same hotel, looking at the exact same clock, while dialing every Lacks in the Baltimore phone book to find out about Henrietta. Following his lead, Rebecca grabbed the phone book and started calling everyone with the last name Lacks. But people either hung up or said they had never heard of Henrietta. Using an old newspaper article, she decided to drive to Henrietta's old neighborhood, Turner Station. To get to Turner Station, Rebecca had to drive past a cement wall and a fence that blocked the town from the interstate. Back in the 1940s, the town was booming with workers from the nearby Sparrows Point steel mill. But after World War II, the mill cut back on jobs, and hundreds of homes were torn down to make room for a new power plant, leaving many families homeless. The population dropped, businesses closed, and the town struggled. Now, a large brick and cement security wall surrounded the housing project where Henrietta's children used to play. Rebecca was looking for a local woman named Courtney Speed, who owned a grocery store and had created a foundation to build a Henrietta Lacks museum. After driving around in circles while friendly children waved at her, Rebecca met a local pastor who happily led her to Speed's grocery. There, she met several of Courtney Speed's many sons, who proudly told stories about how tough and fearless their mother was. When Courtney finally appeared, she was a beautiful, calm woman who welcomed Rebecca into her store. The store's shelves were stacked with everyday items like bread and toilet paper, and the walls were covered with handwritten signs. But as soon as Rebecca mentioned Henrietta Lacks, Courtney's face turned pale. She backed away and nervously asked if a man named Mr. Cofield had sent her. Rebecca had no idea who Cofield was. Courtney explained that she couldn't talk about Henrietta until Rebecca had the Lacks family's blessing. She said that bad things had happened with the Cofield situation, and it had terrified Henrietta's daughter, Deborah. Even the plaque Courtney had gotten for the Henrietta Lacks Museum was hidden away because of all the trouble. Still, Courtney wanted to help Rebecca learn about Henrietta. She took Rebecca to the local library to borrow a BBC documentary tape, then led her to a small beauty parlor she owned. Courtney locked Rebecca inside the shop and told her to watch the video carefully. The documentary, called The Way of All Flesh, told the dramatic story of Henrietta and her immortal HeLa cells. It showed footage of Clover, Virginia, the old plantation town where Henrietta grew up. At the end of the film, Henrietta's cousin, Fred Garrett, stood in a family cemetery, pointing to the spot where Henrietta was buried in an unmarked grave. Fred laughed and said it was a miracle that her cells were still living out in test tubes. When the video ended, Rebecca realized her next step. If Henrietta's husband and children wouldn't talk to her, she needed to travel south to Clover and find her cousins. That night, Sonny finally answered the phone. He still wouldn't meet with her, but he told her to go to Clover and find the family herself, laughing as he wished her luck. Rebecca arrived in Clover, Virginia, with only a sticky note from Sonny Lacks to guide her. It warned her that the town had no lights and got incredibly dark at night, advising her to simply ask anyone she saw where Lackstown was. However, downtown Clover was practically a ghost town. The gas station was boarded up with R.I.P. spray-painted across its front. The old movie theater's roof had completely caved in, and the local supermarket still had half-full shopping carts sitting next to decades-old canned food. The town's population had dropped so drastically over the years that Clover had actually lost its town charter. On Main Street, Rebecca met a man the locals called the Greeter. He was a short, round, white man on a red motorized bicycle who spent his life waiting on the corner to wave at passing cars. Without speaking a single word, he pointed Rebecca across the train tracks toward Lackstown. Crossing those tracks revealed a stark dividing line. One side of the town featured beautiful rolling hills, wide-open property, and white picket fences. Directly across the street, Lackstown began with a tiny, unpainted one-room shack, where vines grew right through the gaps in the wooden walls. Lackstown was essentially a single dirt road, about a mile long, lined with a mix of old slave-era cabins, cinder-block homes, and rusted trailers. Because the muffler on Rebecca's car had fallen off during her drive, everyone in the quiet neighborhood could hear her loud car coming. On her third or fourth pass down the dirt road, an older man wearing a bright green sweater and a black driving cap shuffled out of his cabin and waved her down. He introduced himself as Cootie, Henrietta Lacks's first cousin. Cootie's real name was Hector Henry. He had contracted polio when he was 9 years old. During that era of segregation, local hospitals did not treat black patients, but Cootie's skin was light enough that a white doctor managed to sneak him into a hospital by pretending Cootie was his Latino son. After spending a year living inside an iron lung, a massive machine that helped him breathe, Cootie was left partially paralyzed with severe nerve damage that caused him constant pain. Despite these huge challenges, he managed to build his own house by himself and worked for decades as the Lacks town barber, cutting hair in a vintage barber chair anchored right to his living room floor. Cootie welcomed Rebecca inside and offered her some juice. He told her that the memory of Henrietta was mostly dead in town and that everything about her was gone except her famous cells. Digging under his mattress, Cootie pulled out his only picture of Henrietta, a copy of an old magazine article featuring the famous photo of her standing with her hands on her hips. Because he had never been able to get a proper education, he asked Rebecca if the article mentioned anything about Henrietta's childhood. Cootie remembered Henrietta as a sweet, lovey-dovey woman who always took care of others with a bright smile. Even when she was terribly sick and hurting, she never took her pain out on anyone else. When Cootie's polio had been at its worst, Henrietta was the one who patiently cared for him. Because of her deep kindness, Cootie believed Henrietta always wanted to heal him, and he figured that was exactly why her cells were eventually used by scientists to help cure polio for other people. However, the survival of her cells was a deep, terrifying mystery to the folks in Lackstown. Dropping his voice to a whisper, Cootie explained that some people thought the cells were man-made, meaning voodoo, or doctor-made. He told Rebecca spooky stories about disease-causing spirits that roamed the town, including a terrifying headless hog that dragged a bloody chain around its neck. Cootie wasn't entirely sure if a dark spirit or a doctor had caused Henrietta's sickness, but he was absolutely certain about one thing. Regular cancer don't keep on growing after a person dies. By September of 1951, Henrietta's body was almost entirely taken over by tumors. The cancer had grown on her diaphragm, her bladder, and her lungs. The tumors blocked her intestines and made her belly swell as if she were 6 months pregnant. Because her kidneys could no longer filter the dangerous toxins from her blood, she felt constantly nauseated from the poison building up inside her own body. She required one blood transfusion after another, using so much blood that a doctor eventually stopped the treatments until her debt to the hospital's blood bank was made up. When her cousin Emmett Lacks heard that Henrietta was sick and needed blood, he immediately dropped his tools of the steel mill and gathered his friends to help. These were hard-working men who had slept on Henrietta's floor and eaten her spaghetti when they first came to the city looking for jobs. Henrietta had taken care of them, making sure they didn't get lost on the streetcars, and packing them extra food so they wouldn't go hungry between paychecks. The last time Emmett had seen Henrietta, he had taken her to visit her oldest daughter, Elsie, at the Crownsville Hospital. During that visit, Elsie ran to them and just stood staring, and Henrietta wrapped her arms around the girl. They sat in silence for a long time, and Henrietta seemed relieved to see that Elsie looked okay. That was the last time Henrietta would ever see her daughter, and Emmett figured she knew she was saying goodbye. Now, Emmett and 7 of his friends piled into a truck and went straight to the hospital to donate 8 pints of blood. When they crowded around Henrietta's bed, they were shocked to see that she had withered away from 140 pounds to about 100 pounds. Her cousin Sadie and her sister Gladys sat beside the bed, their eyes swollen from crying. When Henrietta tried to move, Emmett noticed that her wrists and ankles were strapped to the bed frame. Suddenly, Henrietta's body went completely rigid. She screamed and convulsed in pain while a nurse tightened the straps to keep her from thrashing onto the floor. Gladys quickly thrust a pillow into Henrietta's mouth to keep her from biting her tongue during the violent fit. Sadie cried and stroked her hair. Emmett later remembered that horrifying moment, saying that Henrietta wailed like she'd been possessed by the devil of pain itself. The doctors tried everything to ease her suffering, but the cancer was too aggressive. On September 24th, a doctor injected Henrietta with a heavy dose of pain medicine and wrote in her chart to stop all other medications and treatments. 2 days later, Henrietta woke up terrified and confused, momentarily forgetting her own name. Soon after, she turned to her sister Gladys and told her she was going to die. With tears streaming down her face, Henrietta begged Gladys to make sure her husband Day took care of the children, especially her baby girl Deborah. Henrietta had desperately wanted to raise Deborah, to dress her in beautiful clothes, braid her hair, and teach her how to navigate life. "Don't you let anything bad happen to them children when I'm gone," Henrietta whispered to her sister. Then she rolled over and closed her eyes. Gladys quietly left the hospital, took a bus back to Clover, and called Day to warn him that Henrietta was going to die that night. Shortly after midnight, on October 4th, 1951, Henrietta passed away. Part 2. Death. Even though she had changed the future of medicine, there was no obituary for Henrietta Lacks. But word of her death reached Dr. George Guy's laboratory quickly. As Henrietta's body cooled in the hospital freezer, Guy asked her doctors to perform an autopsy. Scientists around the world wanted to create a library of immortal cells like Henrietta's, and Guy wanted to take samples from as many organs in her body as possible to see if they would grow like HeLa. However, to get those samples after her death, someone had to ask her husband for permission. While doctors didn't need permission to take tissue from a living patient, it was highly illegal to perform an autopsy on the dead without a family member's consent. When the hospital first called Day to ask for an autopsy, he said no. But a few hours later, he went to Johns Hopkins Hospital with a cousin to see Henrietta's body and sign some papers. The doctors asked him again. They explained that they wanted to run tests that might help his children someday. Hearing this, Day's cousin told him it wouldn't hurt to let them do it. Finally, Day agreed and signed an autopsy permission form. But he only allowed a partial autopsy to ensure Henrietta would be presentable for her funeral. Soon, Henrietta's body lay on a stainless steel table in the hospital's basement morgue. George Guy's young assistant, Mary Kubitschek, stood in the doorway, breathing fast and feeling like she might faint, because she had never seen a dead body before. She bravely stepped up to the table beside Dr. Wilbur, the pathologist. Mary held open small glass dishes to collect the samples as the doctor carefully cut them from Henrietta's body: bladder, bowel, uterus, kidney, vagina, ovary, appendix, liver, heart, and lungs. The doctor also put bits of Henrietta's tumor-covered cervix into containers to save them for future use. The official cause of Henrietta's death was terminal uremia, which is blood poisoning from the buildup of toxins that are normally flushed out of the body. The tumors had completely blocked her ability to urinate. Tumors the size of baseballs had nearly replaced her internal organs, and she was so covered in small white tumors that it looked as if someone had filled her inside with pearls. As the doctor finished sewing Henrietta's abdomen closed, Mary wanted to run out of the morgue. She kept staring at Henrietta's arms and legs, trying her best to avoid looking into her lifeless eyes. Then, Mary's gaze fell on Henrietta's feet, and she gasped. Henrietta's toenails were covered in chipped, bright red polish. Mary later explained that seeing those red toenails made her nearly faint. For the first time, it hit her that those immortal cells they had been sending all over the world actually came from a real, live woman. She imagined Henrietta sitting in her bathroom, carefully painting those toenails, and the reality of the human being behind the science finally sank in. A few days later, Henrietta's body made the long train ride from Baltimore to her hometown of Clover in a plain pine box. It was raining when the local undertaker met the coffin at the train depot and drove it down the dirt road into Lackstown. Cousins filled their porches to watch Henrietta pass, shaking their heads and whispering prayers. Her cousin Cootie looked into the falling rain and yelled for the Lord to let the poor woman rest. A quarter-mile down the road, Henrietta's sister Gladys and her cousin Sadie sat on the steps of the home house. They had a long pink dress to dress her in, along with a basket filled with makeup, red nail polish, and 2 pennies to rest on Henrietta's eyes to keep them closed. When they finally got the coffin into the hallway and opened the pine box, Sadie began to cry. What made her cry wasn't just the sight of Henrietta's lifeless body. It was her toenails. Henrietta always took such pride in her appearance, and she would rather have died than let her polish get all chipped like that. Sadie realized that Henrietta must have been hurting worse than death itself to stop caring for her nails. Out in the graveyard behind the house, her cousins Cliff and Fred were completely drenched by the rain. They had spent most of the day thrusting shovels into the rocky ground, trying to dig a grave. They had to move several times when their shovels accidentally hit the unmarked coffins of unknown relatives. Eventually, they found an empty spot near the tombstone of Henrietta's mother. For several days, Henrietta's body stayed in the hallway of the home house, with the doors propped open so the cool, wet breeze would keep her body fresh. The morning of the funeral, Day walked through the mud with his children. As Cliff and Fred carefully lowered Henrietta's coffin into the grave and began covering her with handfuls of dirt, something incredible happened. The sky suddenly turned as black as molasses. The rain fell thick and fast, followed by long, rumbling thunder. A blast of wind hit the town with such terrifying force that it tore the metal roof completely off a barn and sent it flying through the air above Henrietta's grave. The violent storm caused fires that burned local tobacco fields, ripped trees straight from the ground, and blew out power lines for miles. Tragically, the wind even tore one Lacks cousin's wooden cabin clear out of the ground, throwing him into his garden and killing him instantly. Years later, when Henrietta's cousin Peter looked back on that terrible, dramatic storm, he just shook his head and laughed. He said that Henrietta was never the kind of woman to beat around the bush, and they should have known She was trying to tell them something powerful with that storm. Not long after Henrietta Lacks passed away, a massive operation was planned for one incredibly important reason: to help stop polio. By the end of 1951, the world was facing the biggest polio epidemic in history. Schools closed down, parents panicked, and the public was desperate for a vaccine to protect their children. In February 1952, a scientist named Jonas Salk announced that he had developed the world's first polio vaccine. However, before he could give it to children, he had to prove it was safe and effective by testing it on a massive scale. This testing required millions of what scientists call neutralization tests, which involved mixing blood serum from vaccinated children with live poliovirus and living cells. If the vaccine worked, the child's blood would block the virus and protect the cells. If it failed, the virus would infect the cells, which scientists could then see under a microscope. The problem was that at the time, these tests used monkey cells, which were incredibly expensive. Testing the vaccine this way would cost millions of dollars. So, the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, NFIP, desperately needed to find a cultured cell that could grow in massive quantities for a much lower cost. The NFIP asked cell culture experts for help, including Dr. George Guy. The timing was perfect because Guy had just realized that Henrietta's cells grew unlike any human cells he had ever seen. Most cells needed a glass surface to grow on, which meant they quickly ran out of space. But HeLa cells were different. They could grow floating in a liquid culture medium that was constantly stirred. This meant they weren't limited by space in the same way. They could just keep dividing as long as they had food. The bigger the vat of liquid, the more the cells grew. In April 1952, Gay and his colleague William Scherer infected Henrietta's cells with the poliovirus. Within days, they discovered that HeLa was more susceptible to the virus than any other cultured cells ever tested. They had found exactly what they needed to test the new vaccine. Before they could mass-produce the cells, they needed a way to transport them cheaply. Gay and Scherer packed a few tubes of HeLa cells into a tin filled with ice and sent them in the mail from Baltimore to Minnesota. When the package arrived about 4 days later, the cells were still alive and ready to grow. It was the first time live cells had ever been successfully shipped in the mail. With this success, the NFIP hired Scherer to oversee the development of a massive HeLa distribution center at the Tuskegee Institute, one of the most prestigious historically black universities in the country. The foundation chose Tuskegee because Charles Bynum, a science teacher and civil rights activist, wanted the center to provide funding, jobs, and training for young black scientists. In just a few months, a team built a factory unlike anything seen before. Its walls were lined with industrial sterilizers, rows of enormous vats of liquid culture medium, and automatic cell dispensers that squirted HeLa cells into one test tube after another. The staff eventually grew to 35 scientists and technicians who produced 20,000 tubes of HeLa, about 6 trillion cells, every single week. It was the world's first ever cell production factory. With those cells, scientists helped prove that the Salk polio vaccine was highly effective. Black scientists and technicians used cells from a black woman to help save the lives of millions of Americans. They did this incredible work on the very same campus where state officials were conducting the infamous Tuskegee syphilis studies, where black men with syphilis were unethically left untreated for research purposes. At first, the Tuskegee Center only supplied HeLa cells to polio testing labs, but soon they were producing so many cells that they began sending them to any scientist who wanted to buy them, charging just $10 plus shipping. Because HeLa cells were cancerous, they grew much faster than normal cells, producing scientific results at a rapid pace. Yet they still shared many basic characteristics with normal human cells, making them the perfect standard tool for studying bacteria, hormones, proteins, and especially viruses. Soon, researchers all over the world were exposing Henrietta's cells to viruses like herpes, measles, and mumps, to study how these infections entered human cells and spread. In doing so, Henrietta's cells essentially helped launch the entire new field of virology. With so many people knowing Henrietta's real name, including doctors at Johns Hopkins and researchers across the country, it was only a matter of time before someone leaked it. Sure enough, on November 2nd, 1953, a newspaper called the Minneapolis Star became the first publication to name the woman behind the amazing HeLa cells. However, the reporter got the name slightly wrong, claiming the cells came from a Baltimore woman named Henrietta Lacks. Right after this article was published, a press officer for the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis named Roland H. Berg contacted Dr. George Guy. Berg wanted to write an engaging magazine article about HeLa, but Guy and his boss, Dr. Richard Talinda, insisted that the patient's real name must be kept a secret. Berg argued that readers need a human interest angle to truly care about the story, and he pointed out that the Minneapolis Star had already made her identity public. Berg even proposed that he should interview Henrietta's relatives. At that time, keeping patient information private wasn't a strict law, but Talinda saw no reason to release the name and risk getting into any trouble. If Berg had used Henrietta's real name, it would have forever connected her family to the cells and the medical discoveries that followed. More importantly, it would have revealed to the Lacks family that Henrietta's cells were still alive, and that they had been taken, bought, sold, and used in research entirely without their knowledge. Because Gay refused to let him use the real name, Berg never wrote his article. However, a few months later, a reporter named Bill Davidson from Collier's magazine reached out to Gay with a very similar idea. Gay took a hard stance. He would only agree to be interviewed if the magazine withheld the patient's real name and let him review the final article. The magazine's editor argued that the public would want to know the human story, but Gay refused to budge. On May 14, 1954, Collier's published a story about the incredible promise of tissue culture. The article celebrated the woman behind the cells as an unsung heroine of medicine, but it called her Helen L. instead of Henrietta. It also included a major piece of false information, stating that the cells were taken from her body after she died, rather than while she was alive. This misinformation came directly from Johns Hopkins. In fact, the head of public relations at Hopkins had helped rewrite the article to correct scientific errors, but he purposefully left the fake name and the incorrect timeline intact. Years later, Margaret Guy claimed that the fake name happened because a publisher simply got confused. But one of George Guy's colleagues believed Guy intentionally created the fake name to throw journalists off the trail. If that was his plan, it worked perfectly. From the 1950s until the 1970s, the woman behind the HeLa cells was most commonly known to the world as Helen Lane, or sometimes Helen Larson. Because her true identity was hidden behind a fake name, Henrietta Lacks's family remained completely in the dark, with absolutely no idea that her cells were still alive. After Henrietta passed away, cousins came from all over to help cook and care for the babies, but tragedy struck the family again quickly. Someone unknowingly brought tuberculosis into the house, and soon Sonny, Deborah, and baby Joe all tested positive for the disease. Little Joe spent much of his second year in the hospital, coughing up blood in an isolation chamber, before being passed from cousin to cousin. Meanwhile, the oldest brother, Lawrence, was trying to take care of the younger children while their father, Day, worked 2 jobs. Wanting some freedom and a life of his own, 16-year-old Lawrence lied about his age to get a voter's registration card. Since he had been born on the floor of their old country house and didn't have a birth certificate, no one could prove he was lying. But his plan backfired when he was drafted into the military. With Lawrence sent away to Virginia to serve in a medic unit, someone else had to step in to raise the children. The adults never told Sonny, Deborah, or Joe what had actually happened to their mother. The children were taught to stay quiet and do what adults said, so they were terrified to ask questions. As far as they knew, their mother was just gone one day, and a woman named Ethel took her place. Ethel and her husband Galen moved into the house, claiming they were there to help. However, Henrietta's cousins, Sadie and Margaret, believed Ethel was simply trying to take Henrietta's place with Day. They also suspected that Ethel took out all her jealous hatred for Henrietta by torturing her children. Ethel treated the kids terribly, leaving them constantly hungry. She fed them only a cold biscuit for breakfast and put latches on the refrigerator and cupboards to keep them out between meals. As they grew, she woke them at dawn to clean, cook, and do laundry. And in the summer, she sent them to the fields to pick worms off tobacco leaves by hand, from sun-up to sundown. If they stopped working before she told them to, she beat them. She once beat Sonny with an extension cord so badly that he ended up in the hospital. But baby Joe got the worst of her rage. Ethel would beat him for no reason, lock him in a dark basement corner on one foot, or tie him up with rope and leave him there for hours. Eventually, the physical beating stopped bothering Joe. Instead, he stopped feeling pain and felt only pure rage. He grew into the angriest child the family had ever known, and people started calling him Crazy Joe. When Lawrence returned from the military, he moved into a new house with his girlfriend Babette. When Babette discovered the horrible abuse Ethel was putting the children through, she insisted that Sonny, Deborah, and Joe move in with them right away. She helped raise them as if they were her own children. Moving out ended the physical beatings for the boys, but Deborah's nightmare continued because of Ethel's husband, Galen. He began touching Deborah inappropriately, and he managed to find her wherever she went. She tried to tell Day about it, but her father didn't believe her. She didn't tell Babette the worst of it, because she feared Babette would kill Galen and go to jail, leaving Deborah without the person who cared for her most in the world. Galen would shower Deborah with gifts when he wasn't being cruel, but he also chased her and attacked her. One day, Babette saw Deborah running into the house crying with a bleeding eyebrow after an incident with Galen. Bobette marched right over to Galen and Ethel's house and threatened to kill them if they ever touched the children again. Deborah just wanted to escape her life. By age 13, she thought about dropping out of school and marrying a neighborhood boy named Cheetah, hoping that having a husband would finally keep Galen away. But Bobette pushed her to stay in school and get an education, saying it was her only hope. School was incredibly hard for Deborah and her brothers because they suffered from nerve deafness. They couldn't hear the teachers unless they spoke loudly and slowly nearby. But they had been taught to stay quiet around adults, so they never asked for help and didn't get hearing aids until later in life. As Deborah grew older, she lay awake at night, crying, wondering about the mother she never knew. Then Day told her something that devastated her even more. She had an older sister named Elsie, who was deaf and dumb, and had died in an institution at age 15. Deborah had never even known she had a sister for most of her childhood. She begged Lawrence to tell her about their sister, and he broke down sobbing. Deborah constantly asked Day and her relatives what had happened to her mother and sister, but she never got real answers. Day would only ever say one thing. Her name was Henrietta Lacks, and she died when you was too young to remember. During Rebecca's first visit with Henrietta's cousin, Cootie, he told her that no one in the family ever talked about Henrietta. He said they didn't say words like cancer and didn't tell stories on dead folks, making it seem like she'd never existed except for her children and those famous cells. "It sounds strange," Cootie told Rebecca, "but her cells done lived longer than her memory." He suggested Rebecca go up the road to talk to Henrietta's cousin Cliff, who had grown up with her like a brother. Cliff was a man in his 70s, still minding the tobacco barn behind his farmhouse. When he heard Rebecca was writing a book about Henrietta, he immediately offered to show her where she was buried. He led Rebecca through a pasture to the old home house where Henrietta grew up. It was a slave-time log cabin that was slowly falling apart. Its floors collapsed under the weight of cows that now roamed free on the property. Upstairs, in the room Henrietta once shared with her husband, Day, there was a tiny woman's open-toed shoe on the floor. Cliff thought it surely looked like Henrietta's shoe. Behind the house was the family cemetery, a small clearing where cows had knocked over tombstones and crushed the flowers. Cliff explained that the cemetery had run out of room decades ago, so people were buried piled on top of each other. He pointed out body-sized indentations in the dirt, which were unmarked graves that sank after the dirt settled around the bodies. He showed Rebecca the tombstone of Eliza, Henrietta's mother, who died when Henrietta was just 4 years old. Cliff waved his arms toward the clearing near the stone, saying Henrietta was buried right around there in an unmarked grave. As they stood in the graveyard, Cliff talked about the HeLa cells. "I heard they did a lot of research, and some of her cells have developed a lot of curing other diseases. It's a miracle, that's all I can say," he told Rebecca. Then he pointed to the dirt and shared an incredible thought. White folks and black folks were all buried over top of each other in that cemetery. There was something beautiful about the idea of slave-owning white Laxes being buried under their black kin. "They spending eternity in the same place," Cliff laughed. "They must have worked out their problems by now." This led Rebecca to look into the history of the Lacks family. Henrietta's maternal great-grandfather was a white man named Albert Lacks, who inherited part of a tobacco plantation in 1885. When Albert died, he left land to 5 colored heirs, one of whom was Henrietta's grandfather, Tommy Lacks. According to Black Lacks oral history, the black families living on the old plantation land descended from white Lacks brothers and the former slaves who were their mistresses. When Rebecca went to visit Carlton and Ruby Lacks, the oldest white Lackses in Clover, they had a very different story. Their living room was filled with Confederate flags. When Rebecca mentioned the black Lackses from Lackstown, Ruby snapped, "Well, that was colored. I don't know what you talking about." She claimed the white and black families never mixed and figured the black families just took the Lacks name when they were freed from slavery. Even within the black Lacks family, race was a complicated issue. Henrietta's sister Gladys told Rebecca that black and white Lackses were kin, but they didn't mix. Gladys also shared a letter from their youngest sister, Lillian. Lillian's skin was very light, so she moved to New York, converted to Puerto Rican, and disowned her blackness because she didn't want to be black anymore. As HeLa cells continued to spread like crabgrass in laboratories around the world, a virologist named Chester Southam had a frightening thought. What if Henrietta's cancer cells could actually infect the scientists working on them? He knew that researchers were constantly breathing in the air around HeLa cells, touching them, and even eating their lunches right next to them on lab tables. Southam decided he needed to test how the human immune system would react to being exposed to these cancer cells. In February 1954, Southam loaded a syringe with a mixture of salt water and HeLa cells and injected about 5 million of Henrietta's cells into the arm of a woman who had recently been hospitalized for leukemia. He repeated this process with about a dozen other cancer patients. He told these patients that he was testing their immune systems, but he kept a massive secret. He said absolutely nothing about injecting them with someone else's malignant cancer cells. Within days, the patient's arms grew red and swollen, and hard, cancerous nodules began growing at the injection sites. Southam removed most of the tumors, but in some patients, the nodules kept growing back, and in one terrible case, Henrietta's cancer cells actually spread to the patient's lymph nodes. Since those first patients already had cancer, Southam wanted to compare their reactions to how healthy people would respond. In May 1956, he placed an advertisement in an Ohio prison newsletter, seeking 25 volunteers for cancer research, and soon 150 inmates signed up. At the time, prisoners nationwide were routinely used for all kinds of medical testing. Many of the inmates said they volunteered because they wanted to pay society back for the wrongs they had committed. Southam injected 65 prisoners, and tumors grew on their arms just as they had in the cancer patients. However, unlike the terminally ill patients, these healthy men fought off the cancer completely. The press praised the inmates as brave heroes and hailed Southam's results as a tremendous breakthrough that might someday lead to a cancer vaccine. Encouraged by his results, Southam went on to inject HeLa and other living cancer cells into more than 600 people in the coming years, including every single gynecologic surgery patient who came to his hospitals. If he explained anything to them at all, he simply said he was testing them for cancer. He deliberately withheld the word cancer from his description of the injection because he thought it would cause unnecessary panic. But the truth was that patients might have refused to participate if they knew what he was really putting into their bodies. Southam probably would have continued doing this for years if he had not made a special arrangement in 1963 with Emanuel Mandel, the director of medicine at the Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital in Brooklyn. Mandel instructed his doctors to inject 22 patients with Southam's cancer cells without telling them. However, 3 young Jewish doctors refused to conduct this research without their patients' consent. These doctors knew all about the horrific, unthinkable research Nazi doctors had done on Jewish prisoners, which had led to the famous Nuremberg trials in 1947. The war tribunal that sentenced the Nazi doctors had created the Nuremberg Code, a list of ethical rules stating clearly that the voluntary consent of a human subject is absolutely essential. The problem was that the Nuremberg Code was essentially just a list of recommendations, not an actual law, and many American researchers like Southam claimed not to know it even existed, or they thought it didn't apply to them. The phrase informed consent had only just appeared in court documents a few years earlier, in 1957, and there was very little regulation over how it applied to medical research. Because the 3 doctors felt the injections were a clear violation of basic human rights, they wrote a resignation letter and sent it to a reporter. A lawyer and hospital board member named William Hyman quickly stepped in, suing the hospital for access to the medical records and comparing Southam's study to Nazi research. Hyman gathered sworn statements from the doctors who had resigned, who described Southam's research as illegal, immoral, and deplorable. The story exploded in the media, launching the hottest public debate on medical ethics since the Nuremberg trials. The New York State Attorney General investigated and accused Southam and Mandel of fraud and unprofessional conduct, powerfully stating that every human being has an inalienable right to determine what is done to their own body. In 1965, the Medical Grievance Committee found both doctors guilty, placing them on a 1-year probation. The negative press from Southam's case caught the attention of the National Institutes of Health, NIH, which funded his research. The NIH investigated its funded institutions and found that very few had any policies in place to protect the rights of research subjects. As a result, the NIH established strict new rules mandating that all human subject research required informed consent and approval from independent review boards. Although some scientists panicked and claimed that these new ethical rules would bring medical progress to a halt, research actually flourished under the new protections, and much of it continued to involve HeLa cells. By the 1960s, HeLa cells were so incredibly robust that scientists joked they could probably survive in sink drains or on doorknobs. They were literally everywhere, even in outer space. Both Russian and American scientists shot vials of HeLa into orbit to study the effects of zero gravity and radiation on human cells. What they found was a little disturbing. While non-cancerous cells grew normally in space, HeLa cells became even more powerful, dividing faster with each trip. Back on Earth, researchers were noticing something else strange. First, it seemed like all normal cells growing in culture eventually either died or underwent a process called spontaneous transformation and became cancerous. This was terrifying for doctors trying to use cell cultures for medical therapies, like one Navy doctor who tried to transplant cultured skin cells onto a badly burned soldier, only to find out weeks later that the cells had turned into cancer. Second, once cells transformed into cancer, they all started behaving exactly alike, producing the same proteins and enzymes. A renowned cell culturist named Louis Coriel pointed out a shocking possibility. All these transformed cells behaved identically to HeLa because maybe HeLa was the contaminant taking over the cultures. To stop the world of cell culture from degenerating into complete chaos, scientists called an urgent meeting. They set up a non-profit federal cell bank at the American Type Culture Collection to test, catalog, and store pure, uncontaminated cell lines under maximum security. It was meant to be the Fort Knox of cell culture. But the media wasn't paying attention to the contamination words. Instead, they were fixated on something that sounded like it came straight out of a comic book: cell sex. In 1960, French researchers discovered that when cells were infected with certain viruses, they clumped together and fused. When they fused, the genetic material from the two cells combined. This was a massive breakthrough. Genetically speaking, humans are terrible research subjects because it takes us decades to produce enough offspring to give scientists meaningful data. With somatic cell fusion, or cell sex, researchers could combine cells with any traits they wanted and study how those traits were passed along. In 1965, two British scientists, Henry Harris and John Watkins, took this an important step further. They fused HeLa cells with mouse cells and created the very first human-animal hybrids, cells that contained equal amounts of DNA from Henrietta and a mouse. This helped scientists figure out what genes do and how they work. Later, scientists even discovered that human-mouse hybrids lost their human chromosomes over time, which allowed them to map human genes to specific chromosomes by tracking the order in which genetic traits vanished. These hybrids eventually helped researchers create cancer therapies and map out the genetic rules of organ transplantation. Scientists were absolutely ecstatic about hybrids, but the public panicked. Throughout the United States and Britain, the media published sensational headlines like "Man-animal cells are bred in lab" and "Scientists create monsters." The Times of London called the HeLa mouse cells the strangest hybrid form of life ever seen in the lab or out of it. People were terrified that scientists were going to create mouse men, or a half-man, half-ape creature called a MAPE. Harris and Watkins tried to calm everyone down. They wrote letters explaining that their story had been sensationalized to distort, misrepresent, and terrify. They assured the public they were just studying cells, not trying to produce centaurs. But it didn't help. The public surveyed the research negatively, calling it an example of men trying to be gods. And as amazing as HeLa's scientific contributions were, the public relations problem for cell culture was only going to get worse from there. When Deborah was a junior in high school, at the age of 16, she got pregnant with her first child. Bobette, who had stepped in to help raise her, cried when she found out, but she refused to let Deborah give up on her education. Deborah wanted to drop out because she felt uncomfortable going to school with a big belly, but Bobette filled out the application for a special school for pregnant girls and dragged her to her first day of class. On November 10, 1966, Deborah gave birth to Alfred Jr., and Bobette made sure Deborah kept studying by making her lunch, getting her to school, and taking care of the baby all day and most of the night. Thanks to Babette's strict but loving guidance, Deborah graduated and was pushed to get her first job to support her child. Meanwhile, Deborah's older brothers, Lawrence and Sonny, were doing fine on their own, but her younger brother Joe was struggling deeply. Authority did not agree with Joe, and he constantly argued with teachers and brawled with other students. He dropped out of school in the 7th grade and eventually joined the military at 18, but his intense anger caused him to fight his superiors and other soldiers. His fighting often landed him in solitary confinement, a dark hole with dirt walls that ominously reminded him of the terrible basement where he was locked up and abused as a child. He was discharged after 9 months because he could not adjust emotionally to military life. His family had hoped the military would help him learn discipline and control his rage, but instead he came out angrier than ever. Not long after coming home, Joe got into a terrible conflict with a neighborhood kid named Ivy. Ivy was a troubled young man who had been struggling with drugs, and he picked a fight with Joe on the street, eventually beating him bloody. That night, a battered and furious Joe knocked on Deborah's door. She cleaned his face, but she could see that he was staring at the wall, his eyes burning with more hate and anger than she had ever seen. The next morning, Joe went into Deborah's kitchen and took her good carving knife with the black wood handle. After working his shift and drinking heavily with a co-worker, Joe found Ivy and stabbed him in the chest, tragically ending Ivy's life. Joe initially fled to his family's hometown in Clover to hide from the law, but he could not escape his guilt and anger, and he eventually called Sonny to pick him up so he could turn himself in. On the morning of September 29, 1970, Joe walked into the Baltimore Police Headquarters and calmly confessed to the crime. After spending 5 months in a cell awaiting trial, Joe wrote a letter to the judge asking for a speedy trial, expressing his regret by writing, "In the most critical time on this earth is now, on this atmosphere today of my mistake. I feel as though I sure be castigate or chastise for the wrong I've did, so I'm ready to get it over now with it." At his trial, his lawyer tried to explain that Joe had a severe inferiority complex from his childhood, and felt it was necessary to protect himself more aggressively than an average person. Joe pled guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 15 years in a medium-security prison. While in prison, Joe finally stopped fighting and focused his energy inward. He found Islam, spent his time studying the Quran, and changed his name to Zakaria Bari Abdul Rahman. Back on the outside, Deborah's life was also facing dark times. At 18, she married the neighborhood boy named Cheetah, but their marriage quickly turned into a nightmare. After their second child, Latanya, was born, Cheetah started using drugs, staying out all night, and violently beating Deborah when he was high. One day, he attacked her in the kitchen while she was washing dishes, breaking a plate across the side of her face. Deborah bravely fought back, defending herself with a knife and pinning him against the wall to make him stop. The abuse continued until one freezing winter night when Cheetah came home drunk and started beating her again in the living room. Deborah reached her breaking point, pushed him down the stairs, and dragged him through the basement onto the snowy sidewalk outside. She was so exhausted and angry that she called Babette the next morning, holding a monkey wrench and threatening to kill him. But Babette wisely reminded her of where anger had led Zachariah, saying, "You kill that man, then what about your children?" Babette's words saved her from making a tragic mistake. The very next day, after Cheetah left for work, Deborah packed up her children and everything they owned and moved out to start a new, safer life as a single mother. In September 1966, a geneticist named Stanley Gartler stood in front of more than 700 scientists at a conference in Pennsylvania. He was about to drop a massive bombshell on the scientific community. Gartler announced that he had discovered a major technical problem in the world of cell culture. While searching for new genetic markers, he tested 18 of the most commonly used human cell cultures and found that every single one of them contained a rare genetic marker called G6PD-A. This specific marker was present almost exclusively in Black Americans. Gartler knew that some of these cell lines were supposedly grown from the tissues of white people. To solve the mystery, he had recently written a letter to Dr. George Guy to ask about the race of the patient who provided the HeLa cells. When Guy replied that HeLa came from a colored woman, Gartler realized exactly what had happened. He told the shocked audience that all 18 of those famous cell lines had actually been taken over by HeLa. Scientists knew that bacteria or viruses could contaminate their cultures, but they had no idea that HeLa could do the same thing. It turned out that Henrietta's cells were so incredibly resilient that they could float through the air on tiny dust particles, travel on unwashed hands, or hitch a ride on laboratory equipment. If even one single HeLa cell landed in a different culture dish, it would consume all the nutrients and completely take over the space. This was devastating news. Over the past 15 years, researchers had spent millions of dollars studying these supposedly different cell types to see how various tissues reacted to drugs and chemicals. If all those cells were actually just HeLa, it meant that years of expensive, painstaking research had been completely wasted. Gartler's announcement essentially meant that HeLa had broken into the American Type Culture Collection, ATCC, a federal cell bank that was supposed to be the heavily guarded Fort Knox of pure, uncontaminated cell cultures. At the time, the ATCC had tests to make sure human cells weren't contaminated by animal cells, but there was no test to see if one human cell had contaminated another. Furthermore, Gartler suggested that a celebrated concept called spontaneous transformation, the idea that normal cells in culture eventually turned into cancer cells on their own, might not be real at all. Instead, those normal cells were simply being conquered by the unstoppable HeLa cells. Gartler boldly stated that any research assuming these cells were from their original organs, like the liver or bone marrow, was basically worthless and should be thrown out. The room sat in dumbfounded silence. Many scientists in the audience became defensive and started firing questions at Gartler, trying to prove his testing methods were flawed. One scientist, Robert Chang, glared angrily from his seat because he had spent years using his Chang liver cell line to discover liver-specific genes, but Gartler's chart listed it as a HeLa contaminant. Another famous researcher, Leonard Hayflick, had grown a cell line from the amniotic sac of his own unborn daughter. when he asked Gartler if white people could possibly have the G6PD-A marker, and Gartler firmly said no. Hayflick joked to the crowd that he had called his wife to make sure he was actually his daughter's father. The room erupted in laughter, and publicly, no one else challenged Gartler's findings that day. However, a few scientists took the warning seriously. Robert Stevenson, a researcher who had helped establish the ATCC cell bank, told top cell culturists to go back to their labs and test their cells. Sure enough, many of their cell lines tested positive for the marker, proving they had been secretly taken over by HeLa. Despite this overwhelming evidence, most scientists simply refused to believe the HeLa bomb was real. Many researchers ignored Gartler's warning and kept right on working with the contaminated cells. But Stevenson and a few others realized how massive the contamination problem was. They began working to develop new genetic tests that could specifically identify HeLa cells, a decision that would eventually lead them straight to Henrietta Lacks's family. 2 months after Sonny Lacks stood Rebecca up, she waited for him again in a hotel lobby on New Year's Day. This time Sonny arrived, proving to be a warm, handsome man with a sweet, bashful grin and a loud laugh. As he drove Rebecca in his daughter's car, he explained that his older brother Lawrence was the only one of the Lacks children who really remembered their mother Henrietta. Sonny only knew what others had told him, that Henrietta was a pretty woman who loved taking care of people and cooking for everyone. Sonny took Rebecca to Lawrence's house, where the large, welcoming 64-year-old was cooking a massive piece of pork and some eggs. Lawrence's main memory of his mother was simply that she was strict, but when it came to her famous cells, he was incredibly confused. He believed her cells were growing as big as the entire world and wrapping around the earth. He had even heard a wild rumor that by the year 2050, babies would be injected with Henrietta's cells so they could live to be 800 years old. Realizing that Lawrence did not actually know what a cell was, Rebecca drew a simple diagram on a piece of paper to explain basic biology to him, and shared how scientists were using technology developed from Henrietta's cells to do amazing things, like helping blind people see. Soon, Sonny brought their father, Day, into the room. Day was 84 years old, frail, and suffering from gangrene in his feet. Day shared his memory of what happened after Henrietta died. He explained that the doctors at Johns Hopkins Hospital asked for permission to do an autopsy, telling him that checking her body might help his children in the future. Day insisted that the doctors never mentioned anything about keeping her alive in tubes or growing her cells. This conversation sparked deep anger in Lawrence's wife, Babette. She yelled that everyone knew Johns Hopkins Hospital used to snatch black people off the streets to experiment on them. This terrifying idea came from a very real, very dark piece of American history known as the Night Doctors. Dating back to the 1800s, white plantation owners would take advantage of African spiritual beliefs by covering themselves in white sheets and creeping around at night. They pretended to be ghosts coming to infect black people with diseases or steal them for medical research, all as a cruel scare tactic to prevent slaves from escaping or meeting in secret. Those white sheets eventually inspired the infamous cloaks of the Ku Klux Klan. However, the fears of night doctors were not just based on ghost stories. In the early 1900s, medical schools in the North actually paid money for human bodies creating an underground industry where black corpses were dug up from graves in the South and shipped in barrels to northern doctors for anatomy courses. Because of this terrifying history, many black residents strongly believed that Johns Hopkins Hospital was built in a poor black neighborhood specifically to give scientists easy access to vulnerable people for experiments. In reality, the hospital's founder, a wealthy man named Johns Hopkins, donated millions of dollars to build a medical school and a charity hospital, specifically to provide free medical care to the poor, regardless of their race. He even left special instructions and money to help care for orphaned black children. Still, the hospital did have a flawed history. For instance, in the late 1960s and 1990s, Hopkins researchers conducted highly unethical studies on poor black neighborhood children, involving genetic testing for criminal behavior and exposure to lead paint without proper informed consent. For the Lacks family, this complex history fueled their deep feelings of unfairness. They believed Johns Hopkins was making millions by selling Henrietta's cells globally, while her own descendants lived in poverty. Day, Sonny, and Deborah all suffered from serious medical conditions like heart disease, diabetes, and arthritis. Yet they often went without health insurance to pay for their treatments. As Bobette passionately pointed out, the most upsetting part of the whole situation was the total lack of respect and communication. Dr. George Guy and the other scientists never bothered to tell the family what was happening, leaving them entirely in the dark while Henrietta's cells changed the world. One afternoon in the late spring of 1970, Dr. George Guy stood in his favorite waders on the bank of the Potomac River, fishing with his friends. Suddenly, he was so exhausted he could hardly hold his fishing rod. Soon after, he learned he had one of the most deadly forms of the disease he had spent his life fighting: pancreatic cancer. Before going into the operating room, George told his surgeons to take samples of his tumor. He hoped his own cells would become immortal, just like Henrietta's, and he wanted to call them the JJ line. But the surgeons found that the cancer was inoperable. Growths covered his stomach, spleen, liver, and intestines. They worried that cutting into the cancer might kill him, so they sewed him up without taking any samples. When he woke up and found out there would be no JJ line, he was furious. If the cancer was going to kill him, he wanted it to help advance science in the process. George Guy died on November 8, 1970. Not long before his death, he told his assistant, Mary Kubitschek, that it was fine to release Henrietta's name if anyone asked. But she never told a soul. A few months later, Howard Jones and several colleagues from Johns Hopkins decided to write an article about the history of the HeLa cells as a tribute to Dr. Guy's career. While looking back at Henrietta's medical records, Jones realized her tumor had been misdiagnosed. Her tumor was actually a very aggressive adenocarcinoma of the cervix, not an epidermoid carcinoma. This type of mistake was not uncommon at the time, and it wouldn't have changed how doctors treated her, since both types of cancer responded to radiation. However, the correct diagnosis finally explained why the cancer had spread through her body so much faster than her doctors ever expected. When the doctors published their tribute in December 1971, this was the first time Henrietta's real name appeared in print. The article also included the famous photograph of Henrietta standing with her hands on her hips, The doctors wrote that her cells had achieved immortality, and their publication forever linked Henrietta and her family to the HeLa cells. Around this same time, President Richard Nixon signed the National Cancer Act and launched the War on Cancer, promising that scientists would find a cure within 5 years. American and Russian scientists even agreed to work together in a special biomedical exchange program. In 1972, Russian scientists proudly announced they had found a cancer virus in cells from Russian patients. However, when the U.S. government tested those cells, they discovered a shocking truth. The cells weren't from Russian patients at all. They were Henrietta Lacks' cells. A chromosome expert named Walter Nelson Rees proved that HeLa cells had floated into the Russian cultures and completely taken them over. Nelson Rees became a sort of scientific vigilante, publishing lists of contaminated cell lines to warn other researchers that their work had been compromised by HeLa. When the news hit that Russian cells had been taken over by American ones, the media went wild. Newspapers ran sensational headlines about cancer cells from a long-dead woman invading other cultures. Suddenly, the press was incredibly interested in the woman behind the cells, but they were still calling her Helen Larson or Helen Lane. Rumors spread that she was Dr. Guy's secretary, or even a completely made-up character. Finally, a scientist named J. Douglas wrote a letter to the science journal Nature. He pointed out that the weight of HeLa cells in the world now exceeded the weight of the woman they came from, and she had achieved true immortality. He asked if anyone knew her real name, arguing that it was time to let her enjoy the fame she so richly deserved. After many wrong guesses from readers, Howard Jones replied to officially set the record straight. The cells were named after Henrietta Lacks. Soon after, a reporter for the popular magazine Science also corrected the error, stating once and for all that Helen Lane never lived, but Henrietta Lacks did. Part 3. Immortality. On a hazy day in 1973, Babette Lacks was visiting her friend Gardenia when she met Gardenia's brother-in-law, a scientist who worked at the National Cancer Institute. When Babette mentioned her last name was Lacks, the scientist was surprised. He told her that he had been working with cells in his lab for years that came from a black woman named Henrietta Lacks. Babette was shocked and said that Henrietta was her mother-in-law, who had been dead for almost 25 years. The scientist explained that he ordered the cells from a supplier and that part of Henrietta was still alive. This felt like a nightmare to Babette, who worried that if researchers were experimenting on Henrietta, they might soon come after her children and grandchildren. She ran home, burst through the door, and yelled to her husband Lawrence that part of his mother was still alive. Lawrence immediately called Johns Hopkins Hospital, but the operator could not find any record of Henrietta. Around the same time, in June 1973, a group of geneticists gathered at Yale University to discuss the massive problem of HeLa cells contaminating other cultures. They realized they could solve the mess if they found genetic markers specific to Henrietta. To do this, they needed to draw blood from Henrietta's immediate family, her husband and children, to map their DNA and compare it to HeLa. Victor McCusick, a famous geneticist at Johns Hopkins, offered to help, since the Lacks family were patients there. He instructed his assistant, Susan Sue, to contact the family and draw their blood. Susan Sue called Day Lacks to ask for permission. Because of her strong accent and the use of complicated scientific words like genetic marker profile and HeLa antigen, Day completely misunderstood the purpose of the call. He had only 4 years of schooling and had never studied science. Day thought the doctors wanted to test his children to see if they had the cancer that killed their mother. Sue never gave the family an informed consent form because she did not consider a simple blood draw to be medical research. Day called Lawrence, Sonny, and Deborah, telling them they needed to get their blood tested for cancer. This news terrified Deborah. She was nearing 30, the same age her mother had been when she got sick, and she was desperately afraid of dying and leaving her own children motherless. A few days later, the family sat around Lawrence's dining room table while Sue and another doctor drew their blood. Afterward, Deborah called Johns Hopkins again and again, asking for her cancer results. The operators had no idea what she was talking about. Deborah's imagination ran wild, and she began to worry that the doctors were actually injecting them with the same bad blood that killed Henrietta. Desperate for answers about what made her mother sick and what part of her was still alive, Deborah went back to Hopkins to give more blood. There, Deborah met Dr. McCusick and bombarded him with questions. Instead of giving her simple answers, he told her that her mother's cells had been sent into space and used in atomic bomb testing. Deborah imagined her mother being blown up by bombs and wondered if the cells could feel pain. McCusick then handed her a heavy, complicated textbook he had written called Medical Genetics and told her it would tell her everything she needed to know. Inside the book, Deborah was stunned to see the famous photograph of her mother with her hands on her hips. She had never seen it before and wondered how the doctor got it. The book was filled with confusing medical jargon that Deborah could not understand, which only frightened her more. Years later, Susan Sue was shocked and deeply saddened to learn that the Lacks family thought they were being tested for cancer. She explained that researchers back then simply did not realize the family didn't understand. Sue wished the family knew how famous and important the cells were, saying that Henrietta would never truly die as long as medical science existed. In 1975, the Lacks family finally learned that Henrietta's cells were being bought and sold around the world. This discovery came thanks to Michael Rogers, a young and talented reporter who worked for Rolling Stone magazine. Rogers had learned Henrietta's real name and set out to find her family. Interestingly, on his way to interview Lawrence Lacks, Rogers's taxi hit another car on the icy Baltimore streets and spun around in 6 full circles. Deborah later believed that Henrietta's spirit caused the accident to warn Rogers to leave her family alone. When Rogers finally arrived, he expected to interview the family, but instead they bombarded him with questions. They had no idea what was going on with Henrietta's cells and were desperate to understand. Lawrence even asked if the cells' immortality meant that the family would live longer or survive cancer. Rogers did his best to explain basic biology to them, helping them understand how cells actually work. At first, Henrietta's sons didn't feel too bad about the cells being alive, as long as they were helping people. But everything changed when they read Rogers's article and discovered that laboratories and commercial companies were selling tiny vials of HeLa cells for about $25 each. Suddenly, the Lacks brothers became convinced that George Guy and Johns Hopkins Hospital had stolen their mother's cells and made millions of dollars. In reality, George Guy was not interested in making money from science and actually lived a very modest life. He gave the HeLa cells away for free, and his lab often struggled to pay for basic equipment. However, while Guy and Johns Hopkins did not sell the cells, several biotech companies built multi-billion-dollar industries by selling human biological materials, including HeLa. Today, some companies sell HeLa products for anywhere from $100 to nearly $10,000 a vial. Since the Lacks brothers didn't know the details of Guy's life, they simply knew someone was getting rich off their mother. So they started handing out flyers demanding their fair share of the profits. Deborah, on the other hand, wanted nothing to do with fighting the hospital. She just wanted to learn about her mother. She bought science textbooks and a dictionary, trying to teach herself biology. In her diary, she wrote about how her mother died in a cold hospital ward meant only for black patients, and how scientists robbed Henrietta of her cells and kept it a secret from the family for over 20 years. As Deborah tried to learn more, she became terrified by the research scientists were doing. When she read that scientists had combined Henrietta's cells with tobacco cells, Deborah imagined a half-human, half-plant monster. When she learned HeLa cells were used to study deadly viruses like AIDS and Ebola, she pictured her mother eternally suffering the painful symptoms of those diseases. When Michael Rogers published his article in March 1976, it was the first time the true story of Henrietta Lacks reached the public. It was the first time the mainstream media reported that the amazing HeLa cells actually came from a black woman. The story highlighted a terrible unfairness. A poor black woman's cells had been taken without her consent and turned into incredibly important medical tools by white scientists. After this, other major magazines like Jet and Ebony published articles calling Henrietta a hero in the crusade against cancer. But while the press was finally telling Henrietta's story, another major violation of the family's privacy occurred. The scientists Victor McCusick and Susan Sue published a research paper in the famous journal Science. In that paper, they published a map of the DNA from Henrietta, Day, and 2 of the Lacks children, sharing 43 different genetic markers with the entire world. Today, publishing someone's genetic information without their permission is illegal and can result in massive fines and jail time because a person's DNA reveals deeply private medical details. But back then, there were no federal laws to protect the family's genetic privacy. The Lackses had no idea their DNA was being studied, let alone published for everyone to see. And they did not know that a man in California named John Moore was about to fight a very similar battle over his own cells, but with the help of a lawyer. In 1976, right around the time Michael Rogers published his article and the Lacks family found out people were buying and selling Henrietta's cells, a man named John Moore was working 12-hour days on the Alaska pipeline. He thought the grueling job was killing him because his gums bled, his body was covered in bruises, and his belly swelled. It turned out that Moore, who was 31 at the time, had a rare and deadly cancer called hairy cell leukemia. This cancer filled his spleen with malignant blood cells until it bulged like an overfilled inner tube. Moore's local doctor referred him to a prominent cancer researcher at UCLA named David Goldie, who told him that removing his spleen was the only way to save his life. Moore signed a standard consent form allowing the hospital to dispose of any severed tissue, and Goldie removed his 22-pound spleen. A normal spleen weighs less than a single pound. After the surgery, Moore moved to Seattle, became an oyster salesman, and tried to go on with his life. But every few months, for years, he flew back to Los Angeles for follow-up exams where Goldie took bone marrow, blood, and semen. Moore started to wonder why a doctor closer to home in Seattle couldn't just do these routine checkups. When he asked about this, Goldie offered to pay for his plane tickets and put him up in a fancy hotel at the Beverly Wilshire. Moore thought this was odd, but he didn't get truly suspicious until 7 years after his surgery, when a nurse handed him a new consent form. The form asked him to voluntarily grant the University of California all rights to any cell line or potential product developed from his blood and bone marrow. At first, Moore circled "do," not wanting to rock the boat or upset the doctor who was keeping him alive. But when the nurse gave him an identical form during his next visit, Moore asked Goldie if any of this follow-up work had commercial value. Goldie said no, but Moore circled "do not," just in case. Goldie began calling him repeatedly and sent another form to his house with a sticker telling him to circle "I do." But Moore refused and sent the paperwork to a lawyer. His lawyer discovered a shocking truth. Goldie had devoted much of those 7 years to developing and marketing a cell line called Mo, made entirely from Moore's cells. It was deeply dehumanizing for Moore to realize that in the medical records, he was no longer a person. He was just Mo, a cell line treated like a piece of meat. Weeks before handing Moore that consent form, Goldie had filed for a patent on Moore's cells and the incredibly valuable proteins they produced. Goldie had already entered into agreements with a biotech company that gave him stocks and financing worth more than $3.5 million, and the market value of the Mo cell line was estimated at an astonishing $3 billion. Moore's cells were exceptional. They produced rare proteins that could treat infections and cancer, and they carried a rare virus that researchers hoped could be used to create an AIDS vaccine. You might wonder how a doctor could patent a living person's cells. Before 1980, nothing biological was considered patentable. But that year, the Supreme Court ruled on a case involving a scientist who created a genetically engineered bacterium that could consume oil spills. Because the scientist had altered the bacteria using human ingenuity, the court decided it was an invention, opening the door to patenting cell lines and genetically modified animals. If Moore had known his cells were so valuable from the beginning, he could have approached pharmaceutical companies himself. This is exactly what a man named Ted Slavin did in the early 1970s. Slavin was a hemophiliac whose blood contained extremely valuable antibodies for the hepatitis B virus. Unlike Goldie, Slavin's doctor actually told him his body was producing something special. Slavin decided to sell his serum to laboratories, sometimes for up to $10 a milliliter. But he didn't just do it for the money. He wanted a cure. He offered unlimited free use of his tissues to a virologist named Baruch Blumberg, and together their partnership led to the first hepatitis B vaccine, saving millions of lives. The major difference between Slavin and Moore, or Henrietta Lacks, was that someone informed Slavin about his tissues, giving him the power to consent and control what happened to his body. Unable to sell his own cells because of Golda's patent, Moore sued Golda and UCLA in 1984 for stealing his tissues and deceiving him. He was the first person to legally stake a claim to his own tissue and sue for profits. Scientists and researchers worldwide panicked. They worried that if patients were given property rights over their tissues, it would create chaos, block medical progress, and stop scientists from sharing samples. The lawsuit dragged on for years, with headlines flipping back and forth as different courts made different rulings. Finally, the Supreme Court of California delivered the definitive answer. They ruled against Moore. The court decided that when tissues are removed from your body, any claim you have to owning them vanishes. You legally abandon them as waste, and anyone can take your garbage and sell it. The judges ruled that the Moe cell line was the product of Golda's inventive effort, not Moore's property. However, the court did agree with Moore on one thing. Golda had breached his duty as a doctor by failing to get informed consent and hiding his financial interests from his patient. While this massive legal and ethical debate about cell ownership played out in courtrooms and newspapers across the country, the Lacks family had absolutely no idea it was happening. As scientists and lawyers argued over who had the right to sell human cells, Henrietta's sons continued to tell anyone who would listen that Johns Hopkins had stolen their mother's cells. Meanwhile, her daughter Deborah simply walked around handing out pieces of paper about her mother, asking everyone to spread the word so the world would finally know Henrietta's true name. Despite her deepest fears, Deborah didn't die on her 30th birthday. She had been terrified of reaching the age her mother was when she passed away, but she made it through and just kept raising her children. She worked all sorts of hard jobs to make ends meet, doing everything from driving a limousine to mixing chemicals at a cement plant. In 1980, Deborah took her car to a mechanic named James Pullum, and they were married shortly after. Pullum eventually became a preacher and opened a small storefront church, and with him, Deborah finally felt safe. When Pullum learned about her mother's famous cells, he suggested they get a lawyer, but Deborah told him to mind his own business. Life was much harder for Deborah's brothers. Zachariah was out of prison, but he still wrestled with a lot of anger and drinking. He couldn't afford rent, so he often slept outside on a park bench or on the concrete steps of a church. Desperate for money, meals, and a warm bed, Zachariah began volunteering for medical studies at Johns Hopkins Hospital. When he needed money for eyeglasses, he even let researchers infect him with malaria to study a new drug. Because he had changed his name, none of the doctors knew they were doing research on Henrietta Lacks's son. The family did get a little bit of financial help from a class-action lawsuit against a boiler manufacturer. Because Day and many other workers had suffered permanent lung damage from breathing in asbestos at the Bethlehem steel plant, Day received a settlement check for $12,000. He generously gave $2,000 to each of his children. Deborah used her share to buy a small piece of land down in Clover, Virginia, hoping that she could someday build a home and live near her mother's grave. But sadly, tragedy continued to haunt the family, as both Deborah's brother Sonny and her son Alfred ended up in jail. The biggest shock for Deborah during this time came in 1985, when a reporter named Michael Gold published a book called A Conspiracy of Cells. No one is quite sure how Deborah got a copy, but when she did, she flipped through the pages as fast as she could to find her mother. At first, she was thrilled to see Henrietta's famous photo and read her real name in print. But as she read the chapter about her mother, she stumbled upon horrifying, private details about Henrietta's death. Without asking the family's permission, someone had given the reporter Henrietta's private medical records. The book quoted extensively from these files, describing Henrietta's excruciating pain, her fever, and her vomiting. It even printed the gruesome details of her autopsy, describing how Henrietta's body was split down the middle and opened wide. The book described her internal organs as being studded with grayish-white tumor globules that looked like strings of pearls. Reading these awful details caused Deborah to fall completely apart. She stopped sleeping and spent her days and nights crying. She couldn't close her eyes without picturing her mother's body cut in half and filled with tumors. She was absolutely furious, staying up late into the night wondering who on earth gave her mother's medical records to a reporter. None of the Lacks family had ever seen those files, and they certainly had never given the hospital permission to release them to the public. Today, publishing someone's private medical records without permission is a serious offense. We now have a strict federal law known as HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, that protects patient privacy, and breaking it can lead to massive fines and up to 10 years in jail. But back in the 1980s, when this reporter got his hands on Henrietta's files, there was no such federal law. Keeping a patient's information secret has been a strict ethical rule for doctors since the ancient Hippocratic Oath, but it was not actually a law that journalists had to follow. Furthermore, the legal system generally agrees that dead people do not have the same right to privacy that living people do. Even though Henrietta's cells were still alive in laboratories everywhere, legally, Henrietta was dead, meaning she had no right to privacy. When Rebecca interviewed Michael Gold years later, he admitted that he hadn't thought about how publishing those records would affect the Lacks family. He just thought the details would add some interesting background color to his science story. He couldn't remember exactly who gave him the files, but he thought it was probably one of the doctors at Hopkins. Regardless of how it happened, the damage was permanent. The private, agonizing details of Henrietta's final days were now out in the world, leaving Deborah devastated and deeply suspicious of the medical community. In 1984, a German virologist named Harald Surhausen discovered a new strain of a virus called human papillomavirus 18, or HPV-18. He found that HeLa cells in his laboratory tested positive for this virus, and to be absolutely sure it was not just a laboratory mix-up, he tested a sample of Henrietta's original biopsy from Johns Hopkins. The results showed that Henrietta had been infected with multiple copies of HPV-18, a very aggressive and virulent strain of the virus. Scientists learned that HPV causes cancer by inserting its own DNA right into the host cells, which then produce proteins that lead to cancer. In Henrietta's case, the virus inserted its DNA into her 11th chromosome and turned off her p53 tumor suppressor gene, essentially breaking her body's natural brakes against cancer. This incredible research eventually led to the creation of the HPV vaccine, earning Surhausen a Nobel Prize. Yet, even with this discovery, scientists still could not completely explain why Henrietta's cells grew so monstrously fast, both inside her body and in the lab. When Rebecca talked to Howard Jones 50 years after he first treated Henrietta, he still remembered her tumor perfectly, because it was unlike anything he had ever seen. While scientists searched for biological clues, Henrietta's family had their own theories to explain her uncontrollable cancer. Her sister Gladys believed the cancer was a punishment from the Lord because Henrietta had moved away to Baltimore, while her cousin Cootie blamed disease-causing spirits. Her close friend Sadie even wondered if something alive had gotten inside her, or if Henrietta had unknowingly walked over something that dropped from space. In the 1980s, during the beginning of the AIDS epidemic, scientists found another groundbreaking use for HeLa. A molecular biologist named Richard Axel managed to infect HeLa cells with HIV. Normally, HIV only attacks blood cells, but Axel inserted a specific DNA sequence from a blood cell into HeLa, making it possible for the virus to infect them as well. This helped scientists understand exactly what the virus needed to infect a human cell. However, an activist named Jeremy Rifkin worried that manipulating DNA was far too dangerous. He filed a federal lawsuit to stop Axel's research, arguing that because HeLa cells were so incredibly good at spreading, they could accidentally infect laboratories around the world with the AIDS virus. It sounded like the plot of a scary science fiction movie, but the lawsuit was eventually dismissed, and the important medical research safely continued. As HeLa cells continued to spread, they also began to change. Just as humans change over time, cells evolve when they grow in a laboratory setting. They are constantly exposed to chemicals and different environments, which can cause their DNA to change, and they pass those changes on whenever they divide. Because Henrietta's cells had been dividing and evolving for decades, an evolutionary biologist named Lee Van Valen suggested they had actually evolved into a completely separate species. He proposed naming this new species Helacyton gartleri, honoring Stanley Gartler, the scientist who first discovered the massive HeLa contamination problem years earlier. Most scientists ignored this idea, knowing that if you took a sample of HeLa and ran a modern DNA test, it would still perfectly match Henrietta's genetic code. The greatest mystery of all was how Henrietta's cells managed to live forever. For a long time, scientists believed that all cells could be immortal in a lab, but a researcher named Leonard Hayflick discovered that normal cells actually have a built-in limit. He found that normal human cells can only divide about 50 times before they stop growing and die, a rule that is now known as the Hayflick limit. To understand why HeLa broke this rule, we have to look at the ends of our chromosomes, which are capped by strings of DNA called telomeres. Every time a normal cell divides, its telomeres get a tiny bit shorter, ticking down like a biological clock. When the telomeres are almost gone, the cell stops dividing and dies, a process that is directly linked to how humans age. By the early 1990s, scientists discovered that Henrietta's cancer cells contained a special enzyme called telomerase. This powerful enzyme constantly rebuilt her telomeres. Because of telomerase, the ticking clock at the end of Henrietta's chromosomes was constantly being rewound. Her cells never grew old, and they never died. This incredible secret of immortality is exactly what gave HeLa the power to outlive and completely take over other cell cultures in laboratories worldwide. In 1996, a BBC producer named Adam Curtis traveled to Baltimore to make a documentary about Henrietta Lacks and her immortal cells. For Henrietta's daughter, Deborah, this was a massive turning point. She truly believed that the documentary would finally allow her and the rest of the world to learn the true story of her mother. And she began dividing her life into two distinct eras, before London and after London. The documentary crew followed the Lacks family to Atlanta, Georgia, for a very special event honoring Henrietta. A scientist named Roland Patillo had organized the first annual HeLa Cancer Control Symposium, and he even convinced the city of Atlanta to officially declare October 11th as Henrietta Lacks Day. For the first time, the Lacks family members were treated like celebrities, staying in a nice hotel and signing autographs for people. At the conference, Deborah bravely stood on stage and gave a deeply moving speech. She spoke directly to her mother, saying, "I keep with me all I know about you deep in my soul, because I am part of you, and you are me." Back in their hometown of Turner Station, the BBC documentary sparked a lot of local excitement. A grocery store owner named Courtney Speed and a sociologist named Barbara Weich decided to create a museum to honor Henrietta. They formed a foundation, created Henrietta Lacks t-shirts, and even caught the attention of the Smithsonian Museum and the U.S. House of Representatives. However, Deborah became furious when she learned about the foundation and its bank account, feeling strongly that if anyone was collecting money, it should go directly to Henrietta's children to help them pay for their doctor visits. Meanwhile, Barbara Weich wrote a detailed letter to the president of Johns Hopkins University, pointing out the moral and ethical issues surrounding Henrietta's cells and the family's suffering. A university official replied that Johns Hopkins had never sought or realized any money from the cells, but a small group at the hospital quietly began planning a way to officially honor Henrietta. Unfortunately, those plans were ruined when a man named Sir Lord Keenan Kester Cofield entered the picture. Cofield contacted Deborah, claiming to be a lawyer who could help the family sue Johns Hopkins for medical malpractice and get them a share of the HeLa cell profits. He seemed knowledgeable, but a lawyer at Johns Hopkins soon discovered the truth. Cofield was a convicted con artist who had spent years in various prisons for fraud, and he was infamous for filing hundreds of ridiculous lawsuits. When Johns Hopkins banned Cofield from accessing Henrietta's records to protect the family, he retaliated by filing a massive lawsuit against Deborah, Courtney Speed, the Museum Foundation, and several hospital officials. Cofield even made the bizarre claim that Henrietta Lacks never actually existed because she was born with the name Loretta Pleasant. The flood of legal paperwork terrified Deborah, causing her to panic and turn against Courtney Speed. Although Johns Hopkins stepped in to help Deborah fight Cofield, and the lawsuit was eventually dismissed, everyone was so spooked by the ordeal that the hospital dropped its plans to honor Henrietta. After the lawsuit ended, Deborah finally sat down in her dark living room to read her mother's medical records. For the first time, she learned that her older sister, Elsie, had been committed to a mental institution called Crownsville. The shock and fear that Elsie might have been experimented on just like her mother caused Deborah to suffer a severe physical breakdown. She broke out in hives across her entire body, and her doctor warned her that her blood pressure was so high she had nearly suffered a stroke. Just a few weeks after she returned home from the hospital, Roland Patillo left a message for Deborah. He told her about a reporter who wanted to write a book about Henrietta and her cells. That reporter was Rebecca Skloot. For nearly a year after their first conversation, Rebecca Skloot refused to give up on talking to Henrietta Lacks' daughter, Deborah. Rebecca traveled back and forth to Clover, Virginia, sitting on porches with Henrietta's cousins and exploring the places where Henrietta grew up. She left frequent messages for Deborah, hoping to share the history she had uncovered. But Deborah never picked up the phone. One day, Deborah's husband, James Pullum, answered and angrily told Rebecca that the family wanted monetary compensation for Henrietta's cells, and they would not talk anymore without an agreement. He explained that Deborah had suffered a lot and was angry because Johns Hopkins Hospital had ignored the family for so long. However, a few days later, Deborah finally called Rebecca and laid down some strict rules. Rebecca had to ensure the world knew her mother's real name, not Helen Lane, and she had to write that Henrietta had 5 children, not 4, making sure her sister Elsie was not forgotten. More than anything, Deborah wanted to find out exactly what happened to her mother and sister. On July 9, 2000, Rebecca and Deborah finally met in person at a bed and breakfast in Baltimore. Deborah was 50 years old, but she seemed both older and younger at the same time. She walked with a cane and pointed to a single gray streak in her hair, calling herself the Gray Child, because she was the one who did all the worrying about their mother. Rebecca brought a very special gift for Deborah, a beautifully framed picture of Henrietta's chromosomes. A young cancer researcher at Johns Hopkins named Christoph Lengauer had created it using a special technique that painted the chromosomes with bright, glowing, fluorescent dyes. Christoph wanted to show his gratitude to the Lacks family for Henrietta's amazing cells. Deborah thought the brightly colored chromosomes were incredibly beautiful, and she was amazed that the world had more pictures of her mother's cells than of Henrietta herself. She really wanted to visit the lab to see the cells in person, but admitted she wasn't quite ready yet. Deborah then dumped a heavy canvas bag onto the bed, revealing a chaotic mix of BBC documentary tapes, a dictionary, science textbooks, diary entries, and even Mother's Day cards she had bought for Henrietta. In her diaries, Deborah wrote about the deep pain of losing her mother and the terrible feeling that her mother had been robbed of her cells. But the bag also contained terrifying tabloid articles that had deeply frightened Deborah. Because scientists had kept the Lacks family in the dark for so long, Deborah struggled to separate science fiction from real science. For example, she told Rebecca that her stepmother had claimed to see man-sized rabbits in the basement of Johns Hopkins, which made Deborah wonder if rumors about the hospital doing terrible experiments on people were true. Furthermore, Deborah showed Rebecca an article from a London newspaper, joking that there were enough HeLa cells to populate a village of Henriettas. Because of this, Deborah genuinely believed that scientists in London had created walking, talking clones of her mother. She even brought out movie tapes like Jurassic Park and a film called The Clone, fearing that scientists were doing similar monstrous things to her mother's cells, like creating human-plant fusions. For 3 days, Rebecca and Deborah became close friends. They ate burgers, rode water taxis, and explored Baltimore together as Rebecca soaked up Deborah's story. Deborah had many charming and funny habits, like randomly spraying a bottle of Lysol into the air and tapping Rebecca with her cane to make a point. She also showed Rebecca a dense medical genetics book she was given by a researcher. He had simply autographed it, without explaining any of the confusing science inside to her. However, Deborah was still very fragile and highly suspicious. Late on the third day, Rebecca noticed a thick manila folder resting on a pillow and reached toward it, asking if it contained Henrietta's medical records. Instantly, Deborah panicked. She dove onto the folder, hugging it tightly to her chest. She yelled at Rebecca, accusing her of trying to steal the records and demanding to know if she was secretly working for Johns Hopkins. Even though Rebecca tried to apologize and explain she meant no harm, Deborah's eyes remained wide with fear. She packed up all her belongings, hissed that she didn't know who to trust, and ran out the door, slamming it behind her. The day after Deborah panicked and ran out on Rebecca, she called Rebecca's hotel room as if nothing had happened. "Come on downstairs," she said. "It's time you went and talked to Zachariah." Rebecca was nervous because she had heard he was the angriest of all Henrietta's children. On the drive there, along with Deborah's two young grandsons, Devon and Alfred, Deborah warned Rebecca to be careful. She explained that Zachariah always felt cheated out of life, because shortly after he was born, their mother's sickness broke down on her. More importantly, she warned Rebecca to pronounce his name correctly, Zachariah, and to never, ever call him Joe. A friend had once called him Joe, his old name, and Zachariah punched the man right into his mashed potatoes. When they arrived at the assisted living facility where he lived, Zachariah was sitting on a bench outside. He was a massive man, about 5 feet 8 inches tall and nearly 400 pounds, leaning on a metal cane. He immediately yelled at Deborah for bringing the kids, so Deborah sent the boys to play and went inside to watch from a window, leaving Rebecca alone with him. Before he would talk, Zachariah wanted to read an article Rebecca had written about Henrietta. As he read, he suddenly slammed the magazine down and yelled because a photo caption incorrectly stated that his brother Sonny was the youngest. "He ain't youngest, I am," he shouted. He told Rebecca that he believed his birth was a miracle. Because his mother was full of tumors when she carried him, he felt it was God's handiwork that he survived without any physical harm. But his anger quickly boiled over when talking about Johns Hopkins Hospital and George Guy, the scientist who first grew HeLa cells. Zachariah felt the doctors had lied to the family and stolen Henrietta's cells. He said that taking a person's cells behind their back was the highest degree of disrespect, comparing it to walking into someone's bathroom while their pants are down. It deeply hurt him that while his mother's cells were famous and making people rich, her own family could not even afford to go to a doctor. Eventually, Deborah came back out, and they followed Zachariah into his tiny, bare apartment. The only decorations on his walls were a few diplomas and pictures of Henrietta and his sister Elsie. Zachariah explained that he believed his mother's cancer cells were the reason he was so mean. He felt he had to start fighting the cancer while he was still a baby inside her womb. But Deborah knew the truth. The terrible physical and emotional abuse he suffered as a child from a cruel relative named Ethel was what truly taught him to hate. Then, Deborah brought out a special gift. she handed Zachariah the beautiful, brightly colored picture of Henrietta's chromosomes that a Hopkins researcher named Christoph Langauer had made. She explained that the bright colors showed exactly where all their mother's DNA was. Zachariah stared at the picture in silence. When Deborah said she wanted him to keep it for his wall, his eyes filled with tears and his whole body relaxed. In a very soft voice, he put his arm around his sister's shoulder and thanked her. Deborah then told him that the doctor who made the picture wanted to meet him and show him the real HeLa cells. Zachariah agreed. He then walked slowly back to his building, holding the picture right in front of his eyes, seeing nothing but the DNA of his mother's cells. The day after Rebecca and Deborah visited Zachariah, a stranger called Deborah with a terrifying warning. He claimed people might try to find Henrietta's grave to steal her bones because her body was so valuable to science. This sent Deborah into a panic, and she briefly decided to stop talking to Rebecca. However, she soon changed her mind, realizing that the truth wasn't just about race or punishing the doctors. She did not want to slander the hospital, telling Rebecca, "We all black and white and everything else. This isn't a race thing." For a full year, Rebecca and Deborah spent a lot of time together, walking around the Baltimore Harbor, reading science books, and visiting the Maryland Science Center. There, Deborah's young grandson, Devon, proudly looked at a massive picture of magnified cells and yelled, "Grandma Henrietta, famous!" Sometimes, Deborah still grew suspicious. She would call Rebecca, demanding to know who was paying her to write the book and how much money she was making. Rebecca explained that she was paying for her research with student loans and credit cards, and she promised that if the book was ever published, she would set up a scholarship fund for Henrietta's descendants. Deborah loved this idea, believing that education was everything. Eventually, she grew so comfortable with Rebecca that she started calling her Boo and treating her like a close friend. As their trust deepened, Deborah allowed Rebecca into her home. Rebecca taught her how to use an old computer to search the internet. Soon, Deborah began taking a strong sleeping pill called Ambien to help her rest. But the medicine made her act like a zombie. She would stay up late in a drugged haze, Googling Henrietta and HeLa and finding bizarre things online. For instance, she discovered a Marvel comic book character named HeLa, a goddess of death who was half black, half white, immune to diseases, and incredibly strong. Because these traits sounded so much like her mother's immortal cells, Deborah genuinely believed the comic was based on Henrietta. One night, after finding an online chat room discussing whether scientists could clone Henrietta, Deborah panicked. She called Rebecca at 3 o'clock in the morning, terrified that walking, talking clones of her mother existed in London. Rebecca had to promise her that scientists had only copied the cells, not cloned Henrietta herself. The stress was a heavy burden on Deborah. She was taking around 14 different pills a day for high blood pressure, anxiety, and depression. Affording these medications was a huge struggle, and she told Rebecca it was deeply frustrating to pay so much for drugs that her mother's cells probably helped to create. Then, in April 2001, some wonderful news arrived. Franklin Salisbury, Jr., the president of the National Foundation for Cancer Research, wanted to hold a massive conference in Henrietta's honor. He planned to invite top cancer researchers from around the world. The mayor of Washington, D.C., and the Surgeon General. He hoped Deborah would speak at the event and accept a plaque to help set the historical record straight and bring the family some peace. Deborah was ecstatic and immediately started planning what to wear. However, tragedy struck the Lacks family again just days later. Deborah called Rebecca, sobbing because her son Alfred had been arrested for robbing several liquor stores at gunpoint. Security cameras had caught him on tape, and the police arrested him right in front of his own house. Deborah was completely heartbroken by her son's actions, but she refused to give up on her journey. Through her tears, she told Rebecca, "I ain't gonna let this stop me from learning about my mother and my sister." By the time Deborah was ready to see her mother's cells for the first time, her father, Day, couldn't come because he was 85 years old and too sick. Sonny had to work, and Lawrence just wanted to talk to a lawyer about suing the hospital. So, on May 11th, 2001, Deborah, Zachariah, and Rebecca Skloot agreed to meet at the Johns Hopkins Jesus statue to go see Henrietta's cells. Deborah prayed at the statue until Zachariah arrived, looking angry and complaining that their sister was crazy for not wanting money from the cells. A few minutes later, a young scientist named Christoph Lengauer walked toward them, smiling warmly. He spoke with an Austrian accent and told them he was really glad to see them. Christoph led them through a long hallway into a room filled wall to wall with white freezers. When he opened one of the doors, a cloud of icy steam poured into the room, making Deborah scream and jump behind her brother. Christoph explained that the freezers were kept at -80 degrees Celsius. He reached into the freezer, took out a small plastic vial, and pointed to the letters HeLa written on its side. He told Deborah and Zachariah that there were millions of their mother's cells inside, and that they could be kept frozen there forever. He also explained how careful scientists had to be, because HeLa cells could easily contaminate other cultures, just like they had done during an experiment in Russia. Deborah joked that her mother was just getting back at scientists for keeping secrets from the family, saying, "You don't mess with Henrietta. She'll sick HeLa on your ass." Christoph then handed a vial of the frozen cells to Deborah. She stood stunned for a moment, then grabbed the vial and rubbed it between her hands to warm it up. She raised the vial, touched it to her lips, and whispered, "You're famous. Just nobody knows it." Next, Christoph led them into a small laboratory filled with microscopes. He knelt in front of an incubator, pulled out a dish with HeLa cells growing in it, and placed it under a microscope attached to a monitor. He zoomed in until the hazy green screen filled with hundreds of individual cells. Deborah gasped and reached out to touch the screen, rubbing her finger from one cell to the next. Christoph drew diagrams on a piece of scrap paper to explain the basic biology of cells and DNA to Deborah and Zachariah. He explained that the DNA inside the cells contained all the genetic information that made Henrietta who she was, including her short height and dark hair. He also explained that her cancer came from a DNA mistake caused by the HPV virus. When Deborah heard this, she was incredibly relieved, because she had always worried that she might have inherited the cancer from her mother. Christoph then moved the slide around on the screen until he found a cell that was dividing into two cells right before their eyes. Deborah and Zachariah stared at the screen like they'd gone into a trance. It was the closest they'd come to seeing their mother alive since they were babies. Zachariah asked why the cells weren't black if his mother was black. Christoph explained that under a microscope, all cells are clear until they are dyed with colors. When Deborah finally looked through the actual microscope, she whispered that the cells were beautiful. Christoph amazed them by admitting that Johns Hopkins had messed up and that the history of who HeLa actually was should be known. He even showed them a catalog where anyone could buy a vial of HeLa cells for $167, and he told them that the family should get a portion of those profits. Though Deborah knew they probably wouldn't get any money, she was deeply moved by his kindness. As they left the hospital, Zachariah, who was usually so full of anger, reached out to touch Christoph on the back and say thank you. He did the same to Rebecca. As they watched him walk away to catch his bus, Deborah put her arm around Rebecca and said, "Girl, you just witnessed a miracle." There were several things Rebecca promised Deborah they would do together. Seeing her mother's cells was first, and figuring out what happened to her sister Elsie was second. So, the day after visiting the science lab, they set out on a trip to Crownsville. It was Mother's Day, and Deborah was heartbroken because her son Alfred had recently been put in jail. But she refused to let that sadness stop her from learning about her sister. Crownsville was formerly known as the Hospital for the Negro Insane. Surprisingly, the outside of the hospital was beautiful, with bright green hills, perfectly mowed lawns, and weeping cherry trees. But inside, the medical records room was an empty, warehouse-sized space blocked by a thick white metal cage. Eventually, they met Paul Lurs, a kind hospital director with a deep passion for history. He gently explained that Crownsville had suffered from a severe asbestos problem in the past, so most of the old records were sealed in bags and buried in the ground to protect people from the toxic dust. However, he had managed to save a small stack of dust-covered autopsy books from an abandoned basement. Lurs pulled out a volume from 1955, the year Elsie died, and miraculously found her name carefully written inside. Attached to the report was a deeply disturbing photograph of Elsie. In the picture, her eyes bulged with fear, her face was misshapen, and she appeared to be screaming. Most terrifying of all, her head was twisted unnaturally to the side, held tightly in place by a large pair of white hands wrapped around her neck. Deborah stared at the picture and whispered, "She looks like she wondering where I'm at." As they read the autopsy report, a bald hospital official stormed into the room and demanded to know what they were doing. But Deborah bravely stood her ground. She gripped her cane, pulled out her legal power of attorney documents to prove she had the right to be there, and the man backed down. Lurs then handed Rebecca a 1958 newspaper article that revealed the terrifying reality of Crownsville. The hospital had been terribly overcrowded, packing patients into windowless basement rooms and forcing them to sleep shoulder to shoulder on mattresses on the floor. Even worse, Rebecca learned that scientists often conducted extremely painful research on epileptic children at Crownsville without getting any permission from their parents. One cruel procedure involved drilling holes into patients' skulls, draining the fluid surrounding their brains, and pumping in air so doctors could take crisp X-rays. The procedure caused crippling headaches and seizures, and because Elsie was an epileptic patient there, it is highly likely this was performed on her. When Rebecca read a quote in the article saying that the worst thing to do to sick patients was to lock them away and forget them, Deborah whispered, "We didn't forget about her." She said she would have gotten Elsie out if she had only known she was there. Instead of being defeated by this horrible news, Deborah was completely energized. As they drove into their hometown of Clover, she proudly showed the new picture of her sister to everyone they met, from people on street corners to waitresses in restaurants. It was a deeply emotional day, and by the time they checked into a hotel that night, Deborah was exhausted, but ready to hand over her mother's medical records to Rebecca so she could finally learn the full truth. A few minutes after checking into their hotel, Deborah pounded on Rebecca's door. She had changed into an enormous white t-shirt that hung past her knees, featuring a stick figure woman and the word "Grandma" in big letters. She was jittery and wide awake, clutching the terrifying Crownsville picture of her sister Elsie in one hand and a bag of her mother's medical records in the other. Dumping the contents onto Rebecca's bed, Deborah declared that it was time to get busy. The pile contained more than 100 pages, all completely out of order. Mixed in with Henrietta's medical files were random items: a land deed, a wanted poster for Deborah's nephew, order forms for HeLa cells, and emotional poems Deborah had written about her mother being used and lied to by doctors. Rebecca pulled up a chair and started sorting the messy pile. Suddenly, Rebecca found a hospital entry dated November 2nd, 1949. She realized this was just 3 days before Deborah was born, meaning Henrietta was pregnant with her at the time. When Rebecca told her this, Deborah screamed with joy, bouncing on the bed and clapping her hands. But as the hours passed, the mood in the room grew dark and heavy. Deborah lay quietly on the bed, staring at the unsettling photo of Elsie. She hated the way the large white hands were gripping her sister's neck in the picture. Then, Deborah started reading Elsie's autopsy report and noticed the doctors had diagnosed her sister with idiocy. She grabbed her dictionary, read the definition out loud, and was absolutely furious that doctors had permanently labeled her sister as senseless and foolish. Deborah then pointed to another medical word in the report and asked what it meant. When Rebecca explained it, Deborah's jaw dropped in horror, and she strictly ordered Rebecca never to put that word in the book. Rebecca promised she wouldn't, but out of pure nervousness, she smiled. Seeing that smile, Deborah snapped. She thought Rebecca was lying and secretly plotting against the family. She jumped off the bed, screaming, and rushed forward, slamming Rebecca hard against the wall. Pinning Rebecca against the plaster, Deborah demanded to know who she was really working for, accusing her of being a spy for Johns Hopkins Hospital. For the first time since they had met, Rebecca completely lost her temper. She jerked free from Deborah's grip and shouted at her to back off, finally cursing out loud. Instantly, the wild panic vanished from Deborah's eyes. She grinned, reached up to smooth Rebecca's hair, and said she was glad to see Rebecca finally get mad, because it proved she was actually human. Deborah later explained that the trauma of dealing with the con artist Cofield had left her deeply paranoid. Cofield had tried to trick the family, and ever since, Deborah was terrified that someone else would try to steal her mother's medical records. Even after they calmed down, Deborah couldn't sleep. She spent the entire night knocking on Rebecca's door every 15 minutes with random, silly excuses, like saying she forgot her nail file or was craving pancakes, just so she could peek inside and make sure the records were still safe. By 6 in the morning, the extreme stress had caused Deborah's face and body to break out in severe red hives. She had spent her sleepless night painting her fingernails a messy, fire engine red to calm her nerves. But despite the chaos, the fighting, and the exhaustion, as they walked down to the lobby for breakfast, Deborah looked at Rebecca and smiled. By later that day, the hives had spread all across Deborah's back, and her cheeks were splotchy and red. Long welts filled the spaces beneath each of her eyes, making them look swollen and shining. Even though Rebecca kept asking if she was okay and suggested stopping to see a doctor, Deborah just laughed and took swigs of Benadryl from a bottle she kept in her purse. When they finally reached their hometown of Clover, they walked along the river, down Main Street, and through Henrietta's old tobacco field. At the home house, Deborah held the photos of her sister Elsie to her chest and asked Rebecca to take pictures of them together. She knelt near her mother's unmarked grave, wanting a picture of the three of them, Henrietta, Elsie, and Deborah, finally together. Afterward, they visited Henrietta's sister, Gladys. Gladys sat in her dark living room next to a burning wood stove, her hands and feet gnarled from severe arthritis. Soon, Gladys's son, Gary, walked in with a big smile. Deborah immediately threw her arms around his neck and showed him the tragic picture of Elsie they had just found at Crownsville. Gary looked at the picture, and then he looked at Deborah, who was pacing back and forth across the floor in a highly anxious state. She started talking incredibly fast, overwhelmed by everything she had been learning about her mother and sister. She told Gary how much it hurt to realize all the tragedy her mother had gone through, but also how it made her feel closer to her. But her pacing didn't stop. She threw herself into a rocking chair and rocked violently, her mind racing with terrifying thoughts. She panicked about the bizarre things she had read online, screaming that scientists had shot her mother's cells into space, blown them up with nuclear bombs, and even cloned her. She cried that researchers had mixed Henrietta with mice to make a human mouse, and gave her mother's cells the AIDS virus. Gary watched her calmly, like a doctor studying a patient. "Don't make yourself sick over something you can't do nothing about," he whispered to Deborah. He told her she had to let the Lord handle her worries. Deborah called her cousin Gary the disciple, because he had a habit of channeling the Lord right in the middle of a conversation. Suddenly, Gary's eyes went unfocused. He stood up, spread his arms wide, and reached toward Deborah. She struggled to her feet and wrapped her arms around his waist. Gary squeezed Deborah's head to his chest and began to pray and sing in a hauntingly beautiful voice. He sang about welcoming the Lord into a broken vessel. Then, sweat pouring from his face, he began to preach. Gary prayed loudly for the Lord to lift the heavy burden of the HeLa cells from Deborah. "Lift this burden, Lord. Take it away. We don't need it," he shouted. Deborah started convulsing in Gary's arms, weeping and thanking the Lord. As they rocked back and forth, Deborah cried out, asking the Lord to take the burden of the cells from her because she simply couldn't carry it alone anymore. Then, Gary looked straight at Rebecca, who had been sitting quietly in a recliner taking notes. Gary yelled that the Lord had sent Rebecca to help lift the burden of those cells. He thrust his hands toward Rebecca and shouted, "Give them to her! Let her carry them!" Rebecca sat completely frozen, terrified, but amazed by what she was witnessing. Deborah stepped away from Gary, wiped her eyes, and laughed, saying she suddenly felt so incredibly light. Gary explained that sometimes a person just has to release their burdens. It had been gently drizzling outside, but suddenly heavy rain pounded the tin roof, turning into hail that was so loud it sounded like an audience clapping. Gary smiled and said it was the Lord turning the faucet on high to wash Deborah clean. Deborah happily grabbed her long black raincoat, opened it wide like an umbrella, and wrapped her arm tightly around Rebecca. "You ready for some soul cleansing?" Deborah yelled as they opened the door and stepped out into the storm. The morning after the intense emotional release, Deborah's hives had improved slightly, but her eyes were still swollen. She decided she needed to head home to see her doctor, so Rebecca stayed behind in Clover to visit Gary. When Rebecca walked into his living room, she found him changing a light bulb and told him she couldn't get his beautiful hymn from the night before out of her head. Gary laughed and said that the song was actually the Lord trying to tell her something. Gary brought out a blue Bible and insisted that Rebecca read specific passages out loud. She read verses about how those who believe will continue to live even after they die, and how a bare seed planted in the ground will eventually sprout into a completely new, full-bodied plant. Gary quietly explained that Henrietta was chosen by God to do His work. He noted that when the Lord chooses an angel, you never know exactly what form they will take when they come back. Gary then pointed to another passage that talked about how the beauty of heavenly bodies is entirely different from the beauty of earthly bodies. As she read the words, Rebecca thought back to the moment she and Deborah first looked at HeLa cells under a microscope. The cells had glowed an otherworldly green, moving calmly like water. To Rebecca, they truly looked like heavenly bodies. When she asked Gary if he believed the HeLa cells were Henrietta's spiritual body, he simply smiled and nodded. In that quiet moment, Rebecca finally understood the Lacks family's perspective. If a person believes the Bible is the literal truth, the idea of Henrietta's cells being immortal makes perfect sense. It explained why her cells were still alive decades after she passed away, why they could float through the air, and why they had been used to cure sicknesses and even travel into space. That is simply what angels do. For Deborah and her relatives, this spiritual explanation was incredibly comforting and much more real than the confusing medical explanations. It made far more sense to them than the cold, clinical science textbooks that described Henrietta's cells using complicated terms like atypical histology, or called them a reservoir of morphologic, biochemical, and other information. To the family, the truth was plain and simple. Henrietta had been given eternal life. Gary playfully warned Rebecca that if she wasn't careful, she might find herself converting to their faith. Rebecca doubted that would happen, and the two of them shared a laugh. Before putting the Bible away, Gary showed her one last verse. It asked why people find it so impossible to believe that God can raise the dead. With a mischievous grin, Gary made sure Rebecca caught his true meaning. When Deborah got to her doctor's office the next morning, Her blood pressure and blood sugar were dangerously high. The doctor was amazed she hadn't already had a stroke or heart attack, and he explained that these extremely high levels were the reason for her panic, confusion, and hives during her trip to Clover. The doctor gave strict orders. Deborah needed to avoid stress completely. Rebecca and Deborah agreed that Deborah should stop going on research trips. From then on, Rebecca only shared the good news she uncovered about Henrietta, like stories of her dancing and watching baseball games in the country. But Deborah was still scheduled to give a speech at the National Foundation for Cancer Research Conference honoring her mother, and she was determined to do it. As she prepared for the event, she also made a big decision. She wanted to go back to school. I keep thinking, maybe if I understood some science, then the story about my mother and sister wouldn't scare me so much, she told Rebecca. She eagerly signed up for adult education classes and took placement tests, hoping to eventually go to college and become a radiation technologist so she could help patients like her mother. Unfortunately, things around her started spiraling downward. Her brothers Lawrence and Zachariah began yelling again, wanting to sue the scientists and demanding that Deborah hand over all the records she had collected. At the same time, her son Alfred called from prison because he was about to go on trial for armed robbery, and a nephew was arrested as well. "The devil's been busy, girl," she told Rebecca. Then came the morning of September 11th, 2001. Rebecca was driving to the conference in Washington, D.C., when the terrorist attacks happened. The city was evacuated, and the conference honoring Henrietta was immediately canceled. Deborah was heartbroken, worrying that it would take another 10 years for anyone to officially honor her mother. The following Sunday, Deborah went to church to pray for her son and the canceled conference. As she sat in the front pew, listening to her husband preach, she suddenly realized she couldn't move her arm. Her 9-year-old grandson, Devon, saw her face sagging and screamed, "Something's wrong with my grandma!" just as Deborah collapsed. Her husband, Pullum, recognized right away that it was a stroke. Devon acted fast. He grabbed Deborah's car keys, ran outside, and got the car ready so his grandfather could drive. As they sped toward the fire station, Devon slapped his grandmother's face over and over to keep her from falling asleep. The medics rushed her into an ambulance, and a fireman told Devon, "Boy, you did your grandmother a favor. You just saved her life." When Deborah regained consciousness in the hospital, her very first words were, "I have to take a test," meaning her placement test for school. Her left side was weak, but the doctor said she would recover. A few days later, she left a calm, happy voicemail for Rebecca. "I feel good," she said. "Better than since before I found out they took my mother cells. I feel so light, you know? It lifted my burden." The stroke actually helped ease the tension in the Lacks family. Her brothers called every day to check on her, and even Zachariah wanted to visit. Deborah told Rebecca that she wasn't going to let herself get scared anymore, saying, "'Cause there's nothing to be scared about with my mother and them cells." Because she couldn't afford college classes on her small Social Security income, Deborah had to give up her dream of going to regular school. Instead, she focused entirely on making sure her grandchildren got educated. "It's too late for Henrietta's children," she told Rebecca. "This story ain't about us anymore. It's about the new Lacks children." 2 months after the stroke, Rebecca went to Pullum's church for the baptism of Sonny's baby granddaughter, Jabria. During the service, Pullum suddenly pointed to Rebecca and called her up to the pulpit in front of the packed congregation. He handed her the microphone and told her to preach. Rebecca bravely told the true story of Henrietta's cells and all the amazing things they had done for medicine. She pointed to Deborah, who was sitting in the front row holding baby Jabria, grinning with tears streaming down her cheeks. Pullum stepped forward and told the congregation that while Henrietta's own children probably wouldn't see any financial benefits from the cells, the new generation would. Pointing at baby Jabria and Devon, he shouted, "This is their story now. They need to take hold of it and let it teach them they can change the world too." On a cold, sunny Sunday in January 2009, Rebecca pulled off the highway and drove into Clover, Virginia. As she passed the post office, she suddenly realized a heartbreaking truth. The rest of the town was completely gone. The old movie theater where Henrietta used to watch films, the grocery store, and the clothing shop had all vanished, replaced by an empty field. Stunned, Rebecca knelt in the dirt and collected splinters of brick and plaster to send to Deborah, knowing Deborah wouldn't believe her hometown had disappeared. It felt as though everything related to Henrietta's history was vanishing. Over the years, so many Lacks family members had passed away. Gary died of a heart attack, Fred from throat cancer, Day from a stroke, and Cootie tragically took his own life. Each time someone died, Deborah called Rebecca in tears, saying that death was just following them everywhere. Life continued to be a serious struggle for Henrietta's children. Sonny had a major heart bypass surgery, and because he didn't have health insurance, he woke up more than $125,000 in debt. Zachariah still wrestled with his anger and struggled to keep a home, though he sometimes worked driving a truck with Sonny. Deborah, however, finally found some peace. She left her husband Pullum and moved into an apartment of her own. By 2006, she was officially divorced. Though she was happy to be independent, she was living in poverty, surviving on a tiny Social Security disability check and a few dollars in food stamps. When Rebecca returned from the empty fields of clover, she tried calling Deborah repeatedly. The book about Henrietta was finally finished, and Rebecca wanted to come to Baltimore to read it to her. But Deborah never returned the calls. Finally, in May 2009, Rebecca dialed Sonny's number. When he answered, the line went silent for a moment before he delivered devastating news. Deborah had passed away. She had suffered a heart attack just after Mother's Day. Sonny had checked on her and found her in her bed, her arms crossed on her chest, smiling peacefully. He gently snipped a lock of Deborah's hair and tucked it inside Henrietta's old Bible, right next to the hair from Henrietta and Elsie. "She's in a better place now," Sonny told Rebecca. He knew Deborah was finally happy and free from suffering. Before she died, Deborah had found great joy in seeing her grandchildren thrive. Little Alfred was doing well in the 8th grade, and Devon was graduating high school, promising to go to college and learn everything he could about his great-grandmother. Even better, her grandniece Erica had become the first of Henrietta's descendants to attend graduate school, inspired by Henrietta's story to study science and psychology. After hearing the sad news, Rebecca sat staring at a photograph of Deborah and listened to their old interview tapes. She remembered a beautiful, quiet moment they had shared while watching an unedited documentary tape. On the screen, a younger Deborah sat holding her mother's Bible. She stroked Henrietta's hair and told the camera that looking at it made her feel less lonely. She imagined what it would be like to have a mother to hug and laugh with, and said she looked forward to being with her in heaven someday. "Heaven looks just like Clover, Virginia," Deborah had told Rebecca. She said she and her mother loved it down there more than anywhere else in the world. When talking about the future, Deborah admitted she didn't want to be immortal and live forever, because it would be too sad to watch everyone else grow old and die. But she smiled and added a beautiful final thought. "Maybe," she said, "she would come back as HeLa cells, just like her mother, so they could do good together out there in the world." When Rebecca tells people the story of Henrietta Lacks and her cells, their first question is usually, "Wasn't it illegal for doctors to take Henrietta's cells without her knowledge? Don't doctors have to tell you when they use your cells in research?" The answer is no, not in 1951, and not today. Right now, most Americans have their tissue on file somewhere. When you go to the doctor for a routine blood test or have your tonsils or appendix removed, the stuff you leave behind doesn't always get thrown out. Doctors, hospitals, and laboratories keep it, often indefinitely. A report estimated that more than 307 million tissue samples from over 178 million people are stored in the United States alone, and that number increases by more than 20 million samples each year. These samples sit in lab freezers, military facilities, the FBI, and the National Institutes of Health. Scientists use them to develop everything from flu vaccines to new drugs for leukemia and breast cancer. Without these tissues, we would have no tests for diseases like hepatitis and HIV. How you should feel about this isn't obvious. Scientists aren't stealing a vital organ. They are using tissue scraps you parted with voluntarily. Still, people often have a strong sense of ownership over their bodies. But that feeling of ownership doesn't hold up in court. Once your tissues are removed, your legal rights get very murky. There are two main issues to deal with: consent and money. For most people, simply knowing if and how their tissues are being used is a far bigger issue than making money from them. However, storing blood and tissues for research does not legally require informed consent. There is a rule called the Federal Policy for the Protection of Human Subjects, which requires informed consent for research on humans. But in practice, most tissue research isn't covered because the researcher never learns the identity of the donors. So it isn't legally considered research on human subjects. People are deeply divided on this. Some researchers argue that giving patients control over their tissues is short-sighted. They believe people are morally obligated to allow their leftover bits to be used to advance knowledge and help others. Since everybody benefits from medical progress, everybody should accept the small risks of having their tissue scraps used in research. But other experts argue that patients should have the right to say no. They believe donors should be able to control who has access to their tissues, because the research might run contrary to their personal or religious beliefs. For example, in 2005, members of the Native American Havasupai tribe sued a university because scientists took tissue samples the tribe donated for diabetes research and used them without consent to study schizophrenia and inbreeding. In other cases, parents have sued to stop the nationwide practice of storing and conducting research on newborn blood samples without consent, arguing it is an invasion of their children's privacy. Privacy is a huge concern because, in theory, scientists can now sequence genes and find out exactly who someone is just from their cells. While the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, HIPAA, prevents doctors from releasing your medical records, ensuring 100% anonymity for a tissue sample is nearly impossible today. Then there is the issue of money. Human tissues and tissue research are heavily commercialized, which is how pharmaceutical companies make the drugs and tests we depend on. It is illegal to sell human organs for transplants, but it is perfectly legal to give them away while charging fees for collecting and processing them. The point of greatest concern in the debate over ownership of human biological materials is gene patenting. In 1980, the Supreme Court ruled that a genetically engineered bacterium could be patented because it was altered using human ingenuity. This opened the door to patenting other living things, including cell lines and human genes, without getting permission from the donors. As of 2005, the U.S. government had issued patents relating to the use of about 20% of known human genes, including genes for Alzheimer's, asthma, and breast cancer. This means that the companies owning those patents control what research can be done and how much the diagnostic tests will cost. For instance, the company that patented the breast cancer genes charges $3,000 for the test, and researchers cannot develop cheaper tests without paying steep licensing fees. Many scientists argue that this practice actually inhibits research and slows down medical progress. Despite all the congressional hearings, reports, and court cases, there is still no single body of law or policy that applies to tissue research. The use of human cells holds great promise for improving human health, but it raises extensive ethical and legal questions that have not been fully answered. As for the Lacks family, they have never actually tried to sue anyone over the HeLa cells. They have few legal options, partly because the statute of limitations passed decades ago. Some legal experts have suggested that since HeLa cells contain the family's DNA, they might be able to withdraw the cells from all research worldwide. But the impact that would have on science would be disastrous, and the Lackses are not interested in stopping HeLa research. Sonny Lacks sums it up best. "I don't want to cause problems for science. Dale wouldn't want that. And besides, I'm proud of my mother and what she done for science. I just hope Hopkins and some of the other folks who benefited off her cells will do something to honor her and make right with the family."